And you can't even drive? I can. Are you stupid, eh? Are you a stupid fool? Well, why can't you drive then? You can't even drive! A bit grey today, isn't it?
I'm here. I'm projecting my voice to the
Hail
back
the king.
auditorium. I am speaking to Roseanne. How was that?
That was wonderful.
I'm actually sitting quite a further back from the mic than I usually do because people have been complaining about clip P's and things. Can you still hear me all right?
Perfectly.
Yeah, very stentorian right now.
I don't want to sidetrack, but we should definitely talk about actors' warm-ups because they are without a doubt the most ridiculous and stupid things you'll have ever seen in your life, basically. But sorry, carry on.
Well, I mean, I did a bit of acting, not after the age of about 18 or 19, but they used to make us do all sorts of. We used to do the Alexander technique. They used to say, imagine a lemon in your kind of backside, and you have to kind of stand up straight as if you've got a lemon clenched between your thighs, and or a piece of string dangling from the top of your head, and then you'd have to do all like facial. To get your face, like you make all these different faces to loosen your cheeks and your eyebrows and your. I mean, Simon, you're probably familiar with all of this.
I was just wondering, was all that stuff, was that like in a private session that was just for you, like after rehearsal or something? All of those warm-ups? I know what you mean about the lemon thing, though. I think it's this is kind of pre-Watershed show. Do I have to be careful with language on this? Reasonably, yeah.
Yeah. No outright swearing or racial slurs, please, Simon.
The thing about the lemon, I've heard about that before. It's something that I've heard about in acting schools where they talk about what you call centering, where you learn basically things like how to breathe, how to stand, really basic stuff, and they do a thing, and I think at RADA they talk about you learn to breathe from your a-hole, so to speak. You center your kind of your gravity and your presence on the stage by dropping your center of gravity to your a-hole, and you breathe from there.
So that's how all the famous actors learn to talk out their ass.
And there was also quite a thing about speaking from your stomach and having
diaphragmatic breathing.
You speak from down there rather than up here. Otherwise, you sound too nasal. You sound too head orientated. You need to be down here.
Yeah.
So there was all that sort of stuff. But my drama teacher, who was quite well known in Wales actually, because he'd sent various people into stardom, likes of Rob Brydon, famously, various other people on Welsh television,
Wonderful.
But he was a very big advocate of Stanislavski.
Yes.
And the method school, Lee Strasberg, and so we were very much encouraged to have Marlon Brando and Al Pacino as our heroes, and being dutiful, they literally were my heroes at that age as well. So and De Niro, of course, but the less said about him these days, the better, I suppose. But yes, so it was all about internalizing to externalize. They talked about but there were a lot of stories about how not everybody was like that, and the one that they shared more than any other was the notorious clash between Laurence Olivier and Dustin Hoffman on the set of Marathon Man, which I'm sure you're familiar with, Simon.
Yeah, I mean, I was really lots of kids went into acting and they did really sort of obsess about Pacino and De Niro, but Laurence Olivier was my acting hero. And I just found that I was gripped by the magnetism of the performances I saw of his on film with Richard III and Henry V, and I could kind of, I sort of liked a kind of mannered, like as Hat says, a stentorian voice on stage, and a kind of very physical style of acting that he was a proponent of.
If people don't know the story, he famously said to Dustin Hoffman on the set of Marathon Man, "Why don't you try acting, man?" You know,
because Hoffman had stayed up all night to try and get a kind of bedraggled and wasted look, hadn't he?
Yeah, he also trained to be like an actual marathon runner and was actually quite a good one at one point, apparently. As did De Niro, was apparently quite a good boxer by the time he'd finished on Raging Bull. And famously, then he put on, like, I don't know, like 150 pounds or something for when he was old in that film. But
what's your opinion on Olivier's Othello?
I only saw it once years ago. Very good, but
I prefer non-Shakespeare Olivier, which could be a bit controversial. I like him in The Entertainer and in Sleuth. And
I was going to talk about that play today. The Entertainer, it's fantastic.
Yeah, I like him in things like The Boys from Brazil. And,
that's another favorite. I love it.
I like him in non-Shakespeare. In fact, I like a lot of those actors in non-Shakespeare, but I do have some old thesps that I do like in Shakespeare. I like Derek Jacobi as Richard II. He's so camp, so mincing, you know. But he's got very good diction, Jacobi.
Beautifully spoken, yeah.
Yeah, he's also, believe it or not, a raging Oxfordian. Like he doesn't believe Shakespeare was Shakespeare. No. Which is unfortunate.
So is Mark Rylance, I believe, who I saw mentioned in the chat. The guy who used to run the Globe. He's a Shakespeare.
I'll just say very quickly before we get going on this topic, because we're just kind of speaking very generally at the moment. Mark Rylance is a superb actor to see in performance. I saw him. I saw him in Richard III. I saw him in. I saw him in a non-Shakespeare play called. He was like on a. It was like a trailer trash play. It was called like Jerusalem. Yeah, he was superb in that as well. So yeah, Mark Rylance is probably one of the better actors I've seen in performance. Not the best actor I've ever seen in performance though.
He also voices the character Bing. Oh no, he's in the TV children's show Bing. So I wonder if you've shown that to AAA yet.
Oh yes, she's familiar with Bing. Yes, she's familiar with Bing. It's not bad. You know,
that's terrible. He's the worst character. I like that Rylance is like stooped so low, like money is so tough that he's doing the kids show gig. But
there's apparently quite a lot of money in that stuff, you know. In doing the kids, you know, they get paid very handsomely for the kids stuff. I'll tell you who the best person I ever saw live in performance though was. And that was I forget his name now. He's probably most famous for being in the thick of it. Not Capaldi, but the Tory MP from the thick of it, whose name
Roger Allam.
Roger, right now
he's one of my he's one of the best living actors in this country, definitely.
Now Roger Allam, I saw him as Falstaff.
Yeah,
was so good as Falstaff. That he, I'm bearing in mind now, I'm someone who's written a book about Shakespeare's history plays and studied them quite deeply. He basically has become my benchmark by which I judge all other Falstaffs. And when I think of the character, I think of Roger Allam as Falstaff first. Now you shouldn't actually do that if you're a scholar, but that's how good he was. That was such a good production of Henry IV.
By the way. On him, there's a film that came out a few years ago, which was an adaptation of a Stephen Fry novel about a washed-up, like failed poet who's like working as a critic of plays in.
Was it Hippopotamus?
Hippopotamus, and the thing is, the first 20 minutes of that film are just Roger Allam going around being obnoxious to people and like trashing.
Sounds amazing.
Trashing the premiere of a play because he thinks it's shit and swearing at people and getting into fights. But the rest of the film is really just dull. But just if you can get hold of that film, just watch the first 20 minutes where it's just Roger Allam being an absolute arse to people.
I mean, he is superb in the thick of it as well.
Yeah, I'm bored. I'm going for a Twix.
All right.
Bit of theatre trivia. He was known as the Voice Beautiful back at the RSC in the mid-'80s when he was there.
He does have a lovely voice.
Yeah.
Also, the radio series Cabin Pressure has him in it as one of the pilots. That's very good.
I've also seen some pretty famous and disappointing people in performance. I watched Ray Fiennes in The Tempest. Shite, just rubbish.
Overrated acting.
It had a really massive budget as well. That Tempest, like rain on the rain and proper like lightning effects, and they really went for it in that, smoke and all that sort of stuff. But it was shite. I also saw Al Pacino in Glengarry Glen Ross. No, not Al Pacino. Jonathan Pryce. Sorry, I saw Jonathan Pryce in Glengarry Ross. I saw Al Pacino in an audience with Al Pacino thing. I haven't actually seen Al Pacino in performance. So Jonathan Pryce was good though, but he didn't play the character he does he played Levine.
Another great Welsh actor, of course. Jonathan Pryce.
Jonathan Pryce, yes. So, no, he was good. Sorry. Just trying to remember some other ones that stand out to me. No, those would probably be it. Roger Allam and Mark Rylance are the best people I've seen on stage. So, I saw David Tennant in Richard II. It's just rubbish. I didn't.
He threw it away. He threw the part away.
He was the golden child of British acting for some time. Back in about 2014, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was a lot better in Hamlet than he was in Richard II. I'll just say that. Yeah. Anyway, how do you want to do this, Pharaoh?
So say again.
How do you want to do this, Pharaoh? I mean, otherwise we'll just ramble on for the next.
Yeah. Do you want to start off first? So the concept behind this was chatting through some of our favourite plays. They could be thematic. They could be. Just the ones you like the most as like a springboard to talk about theatre itself. So I don't know, if you want to start, go to Simon, and then I'll go last.
Okay, but you're gonna have to remind me of what plays I picked. Does anyone remember?
I remember the ones you tweeted out. Yeah, there was Entertaining Mr. Sloane, there was Crap's Last Tape, and Look Back in Anger. Right. Okay. And then I reminded you of them last week, and you said, "Oh, really? Did I really pick those?"
Oh, right. Okay.
I'm not going by the ones I tweeted either. So.
You're having buyer's remorse.
The thing is that I've taught all those plays many times, so I can very easily talk about any of them. Can we, before we get into it, talk about why plays as a form are of literary worth above and beyond novels or poems? They're very different from both novels and poems. And it's always been one of my favorite forms, the play. In fact, remember I said that I seldom, if ever, read novels. In fact, I broke Sartor Rosatus, which I was reading for research for Thomas Carlyle, is the first novel I read since 2003, I think. I'm not very into the novel as a form. But the play is very different because whereas novels tend to have a single viewpoint or a single character, plays, it seems to me, are inherently polyvocal. Does that make sense to you? They've got they register different voices, which means that the playwright's viewpoint, if you want to put it that way, unless they're a particularly bad playwright, can kind of be, you can always see multiple different aspects of a single problem through the prism of the fact that there are these different
Yeah.
competing viewpoints on stage. Now, obviously, some playwrights are better at that than others. Like Shakespeare is probably the all-time best at it. But I find the play in itself is almost like you have. Imagine the playwright as a kind of scientist who's putting these different elements together and seeing what will happen when you have these different combustible parts together, because each character's got their own like logic, I guess. So I like the situational aspect of what a play is. I find it very interesting, both philosophically, socially, psychologically, in all ways. I just find it a much more interesting form than the novel, which seems to me kind of quite boringly bourgeois.
Could I push back on that slightly?
Yes.
So I think the main obvious, this is kind of what you said, is that novels tend to focus on the inner monologues of a character. So you have these kind of two worlds where they can talk to people around them, or they can kind of dwell within their own head, or the narrator can do it. Whereas with a play, essentially what you have is a bunch of people having conversations. So you always have this kind of with certain exceptions, that kind of inner world is hidden. It's there. It's always there, and you're kind of made aware to it by what the characters are saying, but you don't get to sort of engage with it face to face. So it lends a kind of distant. I think basically it's all to do with how you engage with the actual thoughts and feelings of a character. Basically, I don't think that there's any value in saying that one of those forms is superior to the other, because I think it's too broad of a spectrum of pieces of art, basically, to do that.
Weak. That sounds very egalitarian.
No, I don't think that the play is necessarily superior to the novel, or the novel to the poem, or anything. It entirely depends on what you can achieve with that piece of art.
They always say that you should show and don't tell, and it seems to me that a skilled playwright can give you the interiority of a character without having to say, I was thinking this, I was feeling this,
But any writer should be able to do that, whether it's in a novel or in a play or anything else.
But hold on a second. Each of these mediums have different restrictions which allow you to do some, fundamentally different things, and fundamentally because of that, you're only able to achieve certain levels of transcendence or beauty through those mediums. I mean, if you look at classical aesthetics, the way that the Romans used to divide up, they sort of ranked the different artistic mediums, or the arts, as they would call it, and one of the big dividing lines would be between the physical and the kind of intellectual / oral, and they would consider something like poetry to be the highest form of art because it's purely from the intellect, or purely from the speech, as opposed to something like painting, which is kind of like dirty, involves the body. So the hierarchy of mediums has been a question for ages. But I think, just going back to AA's point, I think the play offers a number of, I guess you could say, formats or archetypes that are unique and you cannot achieve in the novel. And I think because of that, the novel is always going to be restricted in terms of the kind of narratives it can talk about and the way it can even approach truth. So, I often find also that some novels are just bursting to turn into plays. I remember I read some novels that are just endless pages of dialogue. I was like, well, at this point, why don't you just break it out and just say, he said this, she said that. I mean, it's just like, well,
Ayn Rand with the 60-page speech.
I mean, there's a lot of that sort of thing as well. So I don't know. I mean, it's at the end of the day, though, it's not really important to tear the novel down to build the to build the play up. I just think that the play is always situationally interesting. You have a space, you have characters in that space, and then now the game's afoot, as it were. And I find it quite exciting. It's quite exciting, you know.
Yes, and you have that collective leverage. It's witnessed as an act collectively. It's not the introversion and privacy of reading the novel.
Yeah.
Go on.
One of the very interesting things that happens in the history of theatre, though, which we should get into before we talk into this, before we get into individual plays, is that Shakespeare's stage was like a kind of empty void. It was like a kind of very broad canvas with which he could furnish it with practically anything. In fact, there's a speech in one of the history plays where he says, like, listen, you know, each man here represents 1,000 men. So the canvas is very, very broad and wide. Okay, the space can be anything. It can be a forest. It can be a battle scene. It can be the inside of a tavern. It can be anything, right? As the history of theatre develops, that space becomes a lot smaller. And by the time we get to some of the plays that we'll be talking about, especially likes of Look Back in Anger, and you know, the stage becomes the room, and it becomes very. A lot of modern plays are just set in one room. Yeah, the action never goes outside there.
Black box theatre, don't they?
So that is something else which is quite interesting. Is the actual space of the stage means different things at different times, and you know, because you've got that square, right? So there's a kind of constriction there. But what different playwrights do in different periods with that space it differs quite widely, and it actually becomes more restrictive. It becomes much more about the domestic room. And I don't know what, like, I don't actually know.
It's almost like there's an arc over time where it becomes much more focused on interiority as well, not on groups of people doing things to each other on stage or individuals doing things to each other on stage, but the stage is a kind of sort of, you know, laboratory or metaphor for the human mind and about what the individual is thinking and feeling, and it becomes much more about a sort of empathetic relationship to characters. You know, much more of a sort of modern, I guess, sensibility.
Yes. In fact, I think that constriction of space comes with, if it comes with anybody, it probably comes with Rattigan and Coward, and the kind of the
particularity of the drawing room, kind of.
The kind of private lives, plays like that, of the 30s. But then, of course, you get the reaction against that, which we're going to talk about a little bit today. Where, okay, now it's not the drawing room of some kind of posh couple who are struggling to have sex. You know, now it's like down people at the dregs of society, people at the bottom, working class types brought onto the stage instead.
Or even a non-realistic space, a non-personal thing. It's often allegorical or metaphorical in some of these more modern playwrights that are a bit more challenging, like Pinter and Beckett.
Oh yes, indeed. I mean, there's a Samuel Beckett play where it's called Act Without Words, where the character literally just tries to escape off the side of the stage, and he's just thrown back on every time he does so. He's flung back on stage, and he can't escape the actual frame of the thing.
Beckett is so bleak. I can't get Beckett at all.
It's an existential metaphor. It's like a kind of Albert Camus on stage. You know, you cannot escape the totality of your freedom. But anyway, where should we start? Because I can't remember what the plays were that you guys chose, but it may be worth doing older ones first for this reason. I don't know.
Well, maybe Simon then, because I think you've got a couple of older.
I was actually wanting to work sort of slightly less chronologically, actually, but I was thinking of actually starting with the most recent one, which is Glengarry, Glen Ross, which was would that is it? Do we need to start at the beginning, or are you happy to sort of randomize it and throw it around
Yeah, I don't really care. Yeah, start wherever you want.
I saw it because, I mean, it's funny because two of the plays I picked today, Glengarry, Glen Ross, and Pinter's The Birthday Party, I just happened to notice you'd taken clips for your recent based scenes in popular culture.
Yes.
And it's sort of come up as, and Glengarry, Glen Ross in particular, I found, really interesting. Obviously, there's the film version out there, which, you can find online, which is slightly different from the stage play, mainly the addition of Alec Baldwin's character. I don't know if people have seen the play. There may be spoilers that I'm going to reveal here, but there's a very famous sequence at the beginning in the film with this Alec Baldwin character coming on as this sort of uber Chad real estate guy who's giving a sort of motivational speech to a bunch of these down at heel, real estate salesmen. And he's very famously excoriating about their ability to be, be capable, to be successful, to be real men in the world of the cutthroat world of real estate. But it was a play that David Mamet wrote in it was presented in 1983. It won the Tony Award, the Olivier, and the Pulitzer Prize. And it was based on his experiences in the late 60s working in a real estate office, where he said what he was doing, I sold worthless land in Arizona to elderly people, essentially. So it was a kind of sort of fly-by-night operation. And it came out, obviously, in this sort of era of Reaganomics. And I think a lot of people at the time saw it as a kind of one of those liberal playwright kind of puts the boot into the system. It's kind of like a suspension of belief in the act of capitalism, if you want to put it that way, and a typical kind of sort of New York liberal attack on the cruelty and the degradation that's induced by the desperation of the capital process, I suppose, if I want to sound highfalutin about it. But essentially, it centers on these four guys working in this office, trying to sell bits of land, parcels of land to, anyone really who they can sort of con into buying this stuff. It's basically sort of worthless stuff, but it's about the American hard sell, and it obviously is taking place, as I say, when you've got to crowbar a bit of economics in. There was a preceding period of high inflation in the late 70s, early 80s, and at this point Reagan tried to turn things around with what was called the Economic Recovery Tax Act, which was a sort of massive tax cut that he tried in 1981, and then he found about a year later he had to completely reverse it. And so there was this sense of the invitation to the sort of the freedoms of the free market and prosperity, and at the same time it was kind of hope was being dangled out at people, and then it was kind of being cruelly snatched away. And I think this is something that sort of Mamet was trying to articulate. But the play itself is kind of these four guys in this office, and they've been set a competition to sell the most parcels of land in a month, and the guy who wins is going to win a Cadillac. The guy who comes second is going to get a set of steak knives, and the other two guys are going to be sacked. So it's a sort of it's a little cruel arena for these salesmen to kind of try and desperately climb to the top of the heap with, and the play charts these guys going through these kind of stresses and machinations to try and succeed in this. And there's four guys. There's a chap called Ricky Roma, who's the kind of the top salesman. He's kind of flashy and ostentatious and a bit of a loudmouth. There's Shelley Levine, who is a kind of the old pro who's he's lost his black magic. There's George Aronow, who is your everyday workaday kind of schlub character. And then there's Moss, who is a kind of quite a bitter sort of struggling salesman, like as they all are, and they're all in the office managed by a guy called Williamson, and is essentially it revolves around them trying to work out how to win this competition. And what they're obsessed around is what's called the leads, and these are the names of people who are potential customers. In con artistry you'd probably say they were potential marks, and the competition is to get hold of the leads. Now the office manager Williamson keeps these in his office, and he's got some brand new leads which are sort of dead cert guaranteed sales, but the aim of the competition is to sift out who is going to get access to those
The
to those
Glengarry leads.
The Glengarry leads, yeah. And
in the theatre production, are they coloured as well? Because in the film version, it's like the green versus the red leads, isn't it, or something like that?
I've not seen the production in the theatre. I was only able to read the text and listen to a radio version. But there's definitely the idea that you have the Glengarry Highlands leads. These are the new leads. These represent the kind of the sort of unattainable future in a way. And the Glen Ross in the title refers to the Glen Ross Farms leads, and these were leads that were sold in the past. You know, they were the kind of the nostalgic past that these guys associate with the good times. And
when the Machine made his name.
Yes, Shelley Levine, the Machine, yeah, and he's played brilliantly by Jack Lemmon in the film. And
I have to say, Jack Lemmon probably gives one of the all-time best performances on. I mean, I would, if I was to do best performances ever in films, that would probably be in a top 5 for me. He's just superb in that film.
Absolutely terrific. Good. Yeah, and it's essentially, in a way, his character is kind of like, it's an update of Willy Loman, Death of the Salesman. You're seeing the process of a man, you know, at the fag end of his career. He's about to be crushed. You kind of know it's coming. He's utterly desperate, and a lot of the atmosphere in the office is very tense, very fraught. They're obsessed about the leads. And, you know, it resembles nothing so much in a way as a bunch of drug addicts, you know, kind of waiting for a fix. In some ways, and actually, it's got an echo of a famous play called The Connection, which was from 1959 by a playwright called Jack Gelber in the Living Theatre. And this was about a bunch of heroin addicts waiting for their dealer to come, and there's a sort of a similar sort of tension in this office with this competition that's being run, and the characters in the office, it's a kind of you know, they're all sort of, you know, beasts sort of prowling this cage, and they all represent, in a way, I thought actually they represented very much kind of, you know, the sort of Vox Dei sort of archetypes. You know, you've got
it may interest you, Simon, that when I used to teach this play, I've taught it many times. I used to get them to do 2 exercises. One, I'd get them to play the John Nash game, Fuck You Buddy.
Yeah.
Which is a classic prisoner dilemma game, right?
Game theory.
Where you basically have to screw over the other person to get ahead. Okay.
Yeah.
And the other exercise I used to make them do was to basically outline their hierarchy of the men. And it doesn't matter how many groups I got to do this, whether they were boys or girls, they basically reproduce the same one every single time. You know, Williamson was the only one people had difficulty placing, but the others are pretty much right themselves.
I would have said Williamson is a sort of classic beta, probably. You know, he's probably someone who's got a wife and a family, and he can he's not the most impressive man, but he can kind of hold his own. He can make good in some way. Roma is a kind of classic alpha, you would think.
Yeah, without doubt, yeah.
And Levine is definitely an Amiga. he's sort of hopeless and prone to some sort of erratic, unpredictable outburst. You know, at some level, he's being ground down.
The Alan Arkin character, what's his name again?
Aronal, George Aronal.
Aronal is Vox Dei's Delta.
Yes, he's got no drive at all.
Gets on with it.
Work of it.
I would have thought actually that the Moss.
He's a Gamma, I would have said.
I would say that if you look at the way Moss carries on in that, the reason I'd put him as a beta is because he's always comparing himself and trying to one up all the time like that, which is kind of a beta trait. They're trying to prove themselves, whereas the Gamma is much more of a kind of
See, I thought that would be Moss. Gamma would be kind of bitter and somewhat destructive, unable to get social traction, and
interesting.
I mean, he sort of checks out of the game at the end.
True, and it's played so well. I mean, all the performances in the film version are amazing. It's Ed Harris, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
Very, very interesting. Okay, yeah.
And so you've got this thing in this, you know, you've got this liberal playwright David Mamet, who who writes this, and the interesting thing is, of course, I mean, in the mythology of David Mamet himself, years later, he writes a famous essay in it's on the Village Voice. You can find it on the website. David Mamet, Why I'm No Longer a Brain Dead Liberal, and he makes this switch to being, what he talks about as being a conservative. I mean, he's possibly a few years behind where we might be, I suppose, as conservatives, but he's kind of free market conservative. He finds that, he starts reading conservative writers. He reads Milton Friedman. He reads
Sowell, famously.
Thomas Sowell, yeah. Indeed, and he begins to realize that it's the overarching influence of government that is sort of kind of ruining people's lives. And he comes to a kind of position which is, well, look, if people left to their own devices can work it out, and this play, in a sense, is kind of like, in a similar way, I think, written at a period before he changes to being a conservative, where he's still a liberal, and he's kind of writing a play in the way that, I think, didn't the guy who made the game Monopoly conceive of it as a way to sort of illustrate the evils of capitalism, actually, rather than as a sort of celebration of it? Because obviously by the end of a Monopoly game, you usually end up with everybody else having no money and one person owning most of the board. So you've got that sort of sense of that those male archetypes, playing out on the stage, the interest in this, for me, is the way language is used. I mean, all the plays I've thought about are about, language and violence. I think, there's the way in which there's no violence physically on stage in the play, but the language here is deployed like weaponry. It's obviously David Mamet, very, very, very famous for his swearing, and You've obviously got the repetition of the leads, this obsession about getting the leads, getting the success, getting ahead. And the leads is mentioned 75 times in the script. The F word is 152 times. The S word is, I've done a bit of AA kind of measuring here. The S word is 45 times. The a-hole word 6 times. Woman appears once, but love and happy and smile don't appear at all. So this is very much a sort of gladiatorial arena.
Let's not forget there are no women in the play at all.
Yeah.
And the only one that we really gets mentioned is James Link's wife. And James Link always was right at the bottom of those hierarchies that the students put together because he's dominated by his wife. He has to ask his wife permission. What a pathetic character he is. And Jonathan Pryce is so good as him as well in the film. So, yes.
Yeah. So I it's very much a male play. Again, the word man appears in the play quite a lot, 32 times, men 24 times. The words take and close and win appear a lot. Deal, money appears a lot. So it's definitely focused in that way.
Have any of you guys ever worked in a sales environment? Because I remember I was at a job at one point. This was probably around 2010, 2011 sort of time. It was kind of a small office. These the owners of the company were very much from that hard 80s background. They wore the pinstripe suits, and they were, they'd made their money back then, and now they were running their own operation type thing. And the whole culture of that office was that they talked about making a sale exclusively in sexual terms. So making money was like cock. Oh, I got some good cock in, and like it would be very somebody. So I was there as a research analyst. Okay, I was not on the obviously as if I would do sales, but I still witnessed everything that was going on because I sat in the same office as them. If you can imagine somebody on the phone standing up, okay, talking to somebody, closing a sale, and they've got their other hand out in front of them, and they're gyrating as if they're riding a horse or a woman or whatever else, and then they do that. The other thing they do often when they were on the phone is they do that. The classic blowjob motion. And they'd be as they were closing it, they'd simulate actually climaxing and things like that. It was extraordinary. It was extraordinary. This was 2010, and there were women in the office as well. I don't know if that sort of thing. I wonder if today, if some of those younger people in the office would try to complain to the law or something. I don't know, but it was quite an environment. It was extraordinarily a kind of sexualized masculine space, where the closure of the sale was seen as like conquering a woman, if that makes any sense. And that's in this play as well, I think. And I think it does capture, if anything, I can imagine it was probably toned down from what was actually going on in the 80s,
Yeah. There's interesting emblematic scenes in the play. You start the play with 3 scenes, sort of two-handers, and each of them sort of shows a different kind of style of I guess salesmanship. Or the first scene, you've got Shelley Levine and Williamson, the office manager, talking, and essentially it's all based around pleading and excuses and lies. That kind of form of trying to sell things to people. The next scene is Dave Moss and Aronow trying to work out a scheme to steal these leads, and essentially it's a sort of clever form of entrapment. That's the kind of another method of salesmanship. And then you've got Roma talking to this guy Link, this poor schlub who he's trying to sell this package of land to, and Roma's technique is seduction. It's selling the dream, the conjuring trick of sales.
Yeah, no, Levine's technique is basically it's kind of a fantasy, is to try to present himself as this big shot, isn't it? With a false assistant. He talks to the assistant, and they, that is praised as being like kind of classic salesmanship technique, where it's all kind of mystique, it's all bluster. And even Roma, Roma sells the dream rather than the product, doesn't he?
Just on that, and real life examples, I used to be in a sales team for a well-known home electronics firm, and the top sales guy would rent out a Ferrari. There's no way he could afford it on the salary, but just to give that mystique of being, this successful person. Because again, when you're thinking about sales and trying to sell to people, it's all about projecting something that the person wants to be. So if you come in as a sales guy and you're good looking, you're well dressed, and you've got a car, people will be like, oh yeah, I'm like that person in their head. So maybe I can't buy the Ferrari right now, but I can buy the small thing to make that sale. But it's interesting how masculine sales is as well. Like there's very few women at all, so it's interesting.
Well, yeah. After I walked out of that job, because I ended up just flat walking out of that job, not because of the politically incorrect banter, but because of because I had a bit of a personality clash with the guy I was working with. I ended up going to work for a bigger firm, and again, I didn't get directly involved in sales, but I'd sometimes be on calls and things like that. But I remember 2 things about that. One is that they used to have these. They probably still have them. It was kind of an open plan office, but there were these glass meeting rooms. So people would be in meetings, but you could see in there because they were made out of glass. And every once in a while, the sales, you'd see the publisher go in there with some sales, a couple of sales minions or whatever, and they'd be getting absolute bollockings. I'm talking like, grown men fully at the top of their voice, and you could hear them through the perspex glass. I don't know what they used to do, but in my experience, salespeople, like they're all like gift of the gab, right? So they would, and I think they'd end up getting bollocks because they promised things that they couldn't possibly deliver, or they'd fail to get any of their paperwork in for that month, or I don't know, they said they'd made a sale and they hadn't done so just to keep face in the meeting and things like that. So there was an awful lot of like insane aggression in the sales team that I've never seen, and like people would just get fired just like that, which just didn't happen in the other departments. And And the other thing about them being male, I do remember there was one saleswoman, but she was like very masculine, very tough,
Yeah,
very blunt. You know.
Either they're super mannish or like super feminine and basically just seduce people. That's what I found.
Well, she would use that when she was with clients, but she was an absolute bulldog in the office. But she used to like taking me in with her because I could just sound smart on the other end of the phone or in the meeting or whatever. But it was. You do witness some extraordinary things when you go into some of those sales environments. I'll just say that. Anyway, shall we?
I invite others to move on. Otherwise, I'll just keep talking about this play. Go on.
Hat. What's a play you want to talk about? So?
Well, I was going to bring up The Birthday Party by Harold Pinter, which I think is known among most of us, isn't it? We've all.
Yes, I've also taught that many times as well.
Yes, I've read it through many times, and I was also in it once as Goldberg, which is good fun. So yeah, I mean, shall we give sort of a brief introduction to Pinter? To the audience. Yeah. So Harold Pinter was a playwright who was kind of known for his very pared down, minimalist but very heavily charged plays. In comparison to someone like Beckett, he was a bit less kind of metaphysical, shall we say. He had a kind of a great flair for kind of British domesticity, I think would be a fair thing to say. And that makes a lot of his plays, especially if you're from the UK, very entertaining, because they're kind of crammed with that that kind of sense, the kind of the various grim emotions that have come about in this country since the end of the war. I think in most sort of types of household. He was working until fairly recently when he died. 2008, 1930 to 2008 was his lifespan, and The Birthday Party was, I think, 1952.
No, it's 58. It's
58. Yeah. I think it was his second produced play.
I sorry to interrupt you, Hap, but the year 1956 is extremely significant in British theatre, so you don't want to get that date wrong. Carry on.
Right. It's worth saying he was a kind of Londoner. He was descended from Sephardic Jews, and he would often talk about that. Quite an interesting lot of stuff with him. Politically, he was, shall we say, kind of very lib, kind of supported all the kind of big liberal things. But he also was like, if I remember, he was massively. Hang on, the Iraq War and the Saddam. I can't remember if he was either massively in favor of it.
He did. He opposed the Iraq War and the Gulf War and the bombing of Kosovo and Afghanistan when we went in. He was very pro-Palestine. He even got behind getting a fair trial for Milosevic. Apparently,
he devoted his Nobel Prize-winning speech to that, basically, talking about very much. There's a potential that he would have been on our side of things today, purely on his opposition to the empire of lies, as we call it.
Basically.
There's a great quote from him about the United States. He said, "The United States was charging towards world domination, while the American public and Britain's mass-murdering Prime Minister, Tony Blair, sat back and watched."
Yeah, he was quite canny on a lot of things. So shall we talk about The Birthday Party as a play? So where should we begin? So it's set in so first of all, so it's this rundown British seaside town, which is one of the greatest places on earth, in my opinion, to set anything, is a rundown British seaside sort of little resort with a beach and a promenade and things. Because you know how you always talk about how much you like the derelict.
Derelict, yes.
I mean, those are kind of the peak. Just Derelict.
Yeah, I remember I had to go down to I was presenting something to some school one day, and I had to go down to Bournemouth, I think it was, and I stayed in like a proper like Faulty Towers effort. You know, it
Yeah.
was there is a strange decayed beauty to
It's hauntingly
the,
lovely, isn't it?
the grotty seaside resort. Yes.
Yeah. Can I just say with that, if you've seen the film of this, which we may talk about, great film with Robert Shaw.
Yes.
It's William Friedkin, isn't it? The
yes. Which is, and the house that's set in. If for those of you in the chat, maybe, or others who may be too young to remember the 70s, that house is almost literally identically the one that my grandmother lived in. And it was like that. The 70s houses, they weren't like the interiors in A Clockwork Orange or anything. They were like that. They were grubby and nasty and horrible.
And too old. And so it's ostensibly it's set in a quote boarding house, but what this actually is an old woman who is basically just opened up her house as a quote sort of little hotel. I mean, like, that's literally all it is. Like, she basically tells herself that it's a boarding house. She has a sum total of one lodger who lives there, called Stanley Weber, who's this clearly just broken man who's running away from something, and all she does is kind of incessantly baby him and flirt with him and annoy him, and she cooks him horrible breakfasts. And
we should mention very quickly. Sorry to interrupt, Hap, but one of the things that Pinter was famous for when he came onto the scene and with this play is his complete lack of character descriptions and context and some of those things that playwrights are expected to provide. He famously did not provide any of it, and I think the famous quote is, like, interviewers would say, well, what are your plays about? And I think the famous line is the weasel under the cocktail cabinet. So
something like that.
Pinter was always like, for many critics and things, infuriatingly ambiguous and refused to elaborate a lot of the time on what any of this stuff was about, who these people were.
I do think the two great mistakes that critics make with Harold Pinter's plays is, one, to try and read way too much into them. I think a lot of them are actually fairly straightforward, and Pinter himself said as much. They're not. It's not necessarily meant to be something you can write, a whole series of books about each play, with all the different subtexts. He didn't like that sort of thing. And also, I think a lot of the time they're produced way too seriously, and they don't have, because in a lot of them, a lot of the plays are actually very humorous. And if you perform them right, they laugh out loud, some of them. I mean, they really are hilarious.
Yeah, the birthday party is both hilarious and
terrifying.
I mean, the famous phrase is the comedy of menace.
Yeah, comedy of menace,
which is applied to Pinter. But the birthday party should be funny, and it is really funny. But then it's also like dark.
It is very dark, and it's kind of you come out of it quite sort of exhausted because you're kind of you feel like you're trapped in this horrible little house with these people for the duration of it. You just want to get out.
I love the grottiness.
The grottiness, yeah. I mean, there's a scene at the beginning where Stanley comes down for breakfast. We should mention that Meg has a husband called Petey, who is a deck chair attendant on the beach, and so he's actually not in it very much. He appears at the start and he appears at the end, and you kind of get the idea that he really isn't that bothered about the situation or living there. He kind of takes every chance he can get to just be outside somewhere. He don't want to be in this house. So yeah, he kind of appears at the beginning. He reads the paper, and they have this conversation where she gives him cornflakes, and she goes, "Were they nice?" And he just goes, "Very nice." And "Oh, how did you find this and that?" "Very nice." Just this utterly stilted conversation. Then he goes off to go to his job, and then Stanley comes down, and she serves him a breakfast of cornflakes and a piece of fried bread. And it's so grim. I mean, just
and they do this horrendous and dark, Oedipal flirting, don't they?
Yeah.
Yes.
Where he says the word moist and
Succulent.
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 You
Oh
can't
my
say that to a
God.
married
She goes,
woman.
am I really succulent? Yeah.
Oh, it's so
It is horrible.
sordid is the word.
And she goes, Stanny, and she goes running after him.
Okay, can I just make a serious point about the dialogue, which is that there had been this tradition in theatre known as social realism, you know, in the line of George Bernard Shaw and these sorts of characters, and then there had been obviously realist plays like John Osborne, which we may talk about later in the stream. When Pinter came out, they initially thought that this was part of something called the theatre of the absurd, like Beckett, or there was a playwright called N.F. Simpson who was a bit Monty Python, like he influenced Monty Python, if you can imagine the sort of stuff. And when this play came out, a lot of people thought, well, clearly this is part of this theatre of the absurd, you know. But if you actually study the way people speak in real life, and the way Pinter characters speak, there is a way, I think it was called hyper-realist, where it's like, well, actually in the real world, people don't speak in complete, perfect English sentences.
No.
They do not wait their turn, and there's a lot of mundane repetition. And one of the things I used to ask students to do when I teach this play, I'd say, well, next time you're at a bus stop, or next time you're kind of out and about, just write down a conversation between two people that you overhear and see what it would look like on the page. And then ask yourself, well, is it closer to Pinter dialogue, or is it closer to, you know, Noel Coward or whoever? And, you know, every time it's going to be closer to Pinter, because those are actually the patterns of the way people speak.
Yes.
You know, do it when your mother is talking to her friend or whatever. I mean, that thing about asking, is it tonight? If my mother makes me something, she'll probably ask me 4 or 5 times. You know.
Yeah. Is it nice? Very nice.
But I never say, oh, yes, mother, we've established that already. Stop asking me the same question. I'll just, you know, it's just
that's how
real
Mr.
life.
D talks.
So I think it's I just think it's worth bearing in mind that this was a very new way of doing dialogue, and it, in a strange way, never really replicated by by people.
Pinter was a master of it. And so yes, so I should go on by saying that Stanley is clearly not meant to be in this house. I mean, like he's not particularly old. He's still sort of a working age, and he clearly isn't a kind of like, he clearly isn't on the kind of the sort of dull level of Meg. He's clearly sort of hiding from something. He's slipped into this underworld, and we never actually find out why. But this is where the mystery of the play begins, because we're trying to understand what this man is doing, and he makes these very strange references to having played the piano in concert halls and things like that. Very strange. And then anyway, Meg, I think, goes out, and then a young woman who we'll talk about a bit later called Lulu comes in. And she's kind of this enormous teasing slut. There's no other way to put it. She comes in and she kind of tries to get Stanley to come out on a date with her. She tells him that she's made sandwiches, and she says, you know, you never ever go out, you never ever wash, you never get dressed, you know why don't you come out with me? And he won't do it, and then she kind of storms off. And then the two men arrive. The two men, Mr. Goldberg and Mr. McCann. And Goldberg is from the outset very, very Jewish, and McCann is very, very Irish. And Goldberg is kind of the sort of leader of the two. He's kind of more charming, more sinister, more kind of intellectual. And McCann is kind of this quite unsure but very kind of physically brutish Irishman. Constantly makes references to Irish Catholicism, as Goldberg makes references to Judaism. Two men. In fact, this was actually a strange thing that this influenced a lot was Pulp Fiction. You know, of course, how Jules and what's the other one's name in Pulp Fiction? You know, there's sort of two men.
Yeah, Vincent Vega. Yeah,
Vince Vega. Yeah, the sort of two men in suits. Appearing as agents of something.
Yeah, and it's also a very similar setup to Funny Games. If you've ever seen that film. Funny Games is the same thing. Two strangers come and terrorize somebody. There are some that, if I was to say, well, where does this idea come from? Did Pinter invent it? J.B. Priestley, if you're familiar with any of his plays, liked to use this device quite a lot. Most famously in An Inspector Calls. You can kind of see Goldberg and McCann as a little bit like a J.B. Priestley device, if you want to put it that way. Only obviously Pinter is a million miles removed from Priestley.
We don't know. We don't know on what authority these two have arrived, and they don't say. But from the outset, Stanley is terrified of them. He is manically terrified, and yet he never quite tries to run. There's a kind of sense throughout the play that he knows this is his last bolt hole. That there's the fact that these two have found him means that there's no point in trying to run. But rather than go to work on him immediately, they kind of, for some reason, they play into the atmosphere of the house, and they kind of Goldberg charms the landlady who is as she is. And Meg reveals that it's actually Stanley's birthday that night. And she's, again, you mentioned the kind of very disturbing Oedipal context here. She buys him for his birthday present a toy drum, a toy, like a little child's toy drum, and for some reason, of course, she says that it's because, well, he used to be a pianist, so she thought she'd get him a musical instrument. Yes, and then it builds up to the famous interrogation scene. Now, do you two have anything to say about this?
I inserted it into. I've recently released on AA Gold based moments in pop culture history. I can't remember if it was in part 1 or part 2, but I put that scene in its entirety.
Yeah.
I don't know if whether it is really based or not, but I kind of dig it because I'm dark.
Well, I mean, they psychologically
break him down.
It. Yeah, he's snapped in half, basically.
Yeah.
Yes, very interesting scene. I should mention, by the way, that somebody in the chat is saying that these days Goldberg may change his name. That there is actually a point. It's a point. He's known as Nat. He's known as Simey.
Benny.
He's got different names throughout the play, hasn't he?
And he gets extremely angry when McCann refers to him as
Simey. Yeah,
he goes absolutely spare. And the thing about the interrogation scene that makes it so odd is that the questions they're asking are so strange. They start by asking him questions about who he is, why did he change his name, and then they start asking him, like, were you in the Lion's Corner tea shop when you abandoned your wife, and what's the square root of 368, and what about the Albigensenist heresy? And they start pushing all these utterly strange questions.
Is the number
846
positive or necessary?
846 possible or necessary?
Yeah, that's right. And I have to say, because the interrogation scene is so quick, it's so rapid, that I remember when we were doing it, we spent about 2 months just rehearsing that scene, because it took us so long just to get all the beats and the kind of machine gun speed at which it goes. Very, very, very difficult.
I should mention as well that this is something else for which Pinter was famous, was basically he was known for his very long silences and long pauses. Okay. Yes. Because when you're in the theater, silence makes people extremely uncomfortable. So there were these these pauses that go on for a little bit too long. But the flip side of that is that you also have these sequences like this interrogation scene where the dialogue builds to a frenzy, and it's very fast, and there's a rhythm to it. You know, when they really start getting going on their incessant questioning of Stanley, it's almost musical, and then there's a pause. You know, so
it all stops. You know,
you get these crescendos, and then you get these silences. So it is a Pinter play. I mean, all his plays are a bit like this, but The Birthday Party in particular does have this musical element to it as well, I would say.
And there's also a problem with Pinter, if I can just cut it in there, that when you're performing Pinter, I did one of his plays, The Hot House, about 16 years ago. And I don't know if you found this, Panama Hat, but you know, one of the difficulties when you're rehearsing is, as actors, you're trying to build narratives that sort of logically connect things in terms of realistic behavior and motivation. And, you know, you often find that frustration with directors, they'll end up saying, look, don't try to make sense of it in some way. Because as actors, certainly, you're trained to kind of create backstories and narratives, and like, what are we doing when we go off stage? What happens over there? How do we tie up these bits of the story? How do you sort of flesh out the world of these characters to bed them in a convincing way on that stage? And it's difficult with Pinter because you make these inferences about the characters. I mean, you think maybe, you know, are Goldberg and McCann like kind of sort of mob guys, you know, and is Stanley on the run from them? And then they talk about when they're interrogating him, you know, you betrayed the organization. Oh, okay, is some sort of espionage angle here or something like that? Yes. And then I think McCann says at one point, you sort of, you're a traitor to the cloth. And then you think, there's some religious aspect to this, you know, and obviously, McCann and Goldberg, a lot of people interpret them as kind of, you know, metonyms for Judaism and Catholicism, and so you try to ascribe all these aspects that you think are consistent in the real world, let's say, in order to sort of create what as actors you call reported behavior on stage, where, i.e., you try to replicate real everyday behavior, and you can't quite do it because there's all these inconsistencies in the stories that they're telling. So, as you said, there's the thing about Goldberg's name seems to change throughout, and then certain facts about, you know, the past seem to get a bit vague, and then they're contested, and you sort of can't quite hold on to it. And this is sort of Pinter doing this thing of, as the individual's mind fragments, the language kind of breaks apart as well.
Yes. I mean, you also get the sense that he's hiding behind so many layers of lie that you don't know which one of them even is the truth, you know, or which you know, it's flicking in between them intermittently.
I mean, I've always thought that the I mean, I may want to revisit this reading, but you know, when I wrote on it years ago, and when I thought about, well, what is this play really about, I always thought it was more a kind of metaphor for what happens to individuals in society in general. And the Goldberg and McCann are like just they're a stand-in for all social pressures, and Stanley just wants to opt out for whatever reason, and he's just not allowed. You know, you're just not allowed to opt out, and if you try to do so, they will literally recondition you. You know, there's a line towards the end of the play where I can't. What does Petey say to him?
Oh, well, hang on, because I was going to get onto this.
All right.
So I'll run through this really quickly. So anyway, right after they interrogate him, and he's basically snapped, and he tries to attack them with a chair, to try and basically, you know, to get away. But right as he does that, Meg comes in wearing like an absurd old sort of moth-eaten party dress, and she's also quite drunk. And she says, "Come on, we're going to have the birthday party now. We're going to have the party." So they all kind of sort of calm down for a bit, and they participate in this party. Lulu comes in wearing a very tight dress, and is immediately kind of flirted with by Goldberg, who kind of starts to charm her. And during the party, they play a game of blind man's buff. And during this, basically, McCann starts to continue to torture Stanley. He breaks his glasses. There's the character of Stanley is kind of has a fixation with his glasses. He's constantly kind of cleaning them, and he's clearly sort of blind without them. And he puts his foot through the drum, and then there's a kind of, and then all of a sudden he attacks Meg, and there's a blackout. And then when the lights go up, he's trying to rape Lulu. He's got to like spread out on the table, and there's screaming. And then Goldberg and McCann push him up against the wall, where he's just laughing. He's just laughing, just insane, just hysterical laughter. And then it just cuts back to the next morning. And PT and Meg are talking about the party with their normal sort of, innocuous, was it nice? Very nice, kind of thing. And then Stanley comes in a very clean black suit with a white shirt, and Goldberg and McCann have him, and he can't talk. And Goldberg and McCann do a kind of version of their interrogation where they go sort of like, we'll make a new man out of you. We'll have new shoes. You'll have new glasses. You'll do this. You'll do that. Holding him and sort of slapping him on the back. And then there's a moment where Goldberg loses his rag at McCann for using the wrong name. And there's a kind of breaking of the friendship between those two. There seems to be a kind of fracturing of their relationship. And then as they're taking him away, Petey, who is sat at the kitchen table, this is the line, he calls out, "Stan, don't let them tell you what to do." And then that's it, basically.
If I was casting the play, by the way, I would cast Shinobi Aka as PT.
Yes, he's perfect. He's perfect as PT.
Yeah.
Yes, but anyway, I did think that the do you know that Kink song where they say "Here come the people in grey to take you away"? Is it?
I think so.
I've always thought that that's essentially who Goldberg and McCann were. It doesn't actually matter who they represent. It's basically just society in general. I mean, these days they'd be trying to indoctrinate you into the kind of woke ideology, but it doesn't really matter because it's the whole process of the individual versus society, and that was always what I thought this play was about. But maybe I'm wrong.
A modern version of the lyrics are, "Here are the people in grey to make you gay."
Yeah, exactly. Here are the people in grey to make you you a gay. Yeah.
The end does sort of echo. I mean, when you see it produced, the end where Stanley's being led out of the house and he's kind of he's lost the power of speech at that point. I mean, in a way, the whole thing to me, it seems like he's sort of an allegory of life and death. This play, he's kind of he's pulled, kind of mewling and puking out of his bed by Meg. He's this kind of stroppy teenager in the first few scenes. He's very emotionally erratic, and then he sort of he's broken down over the course of the play, such that by the end, when they're taking him away, he's been shaved, he's been put in a suit. He looks like a corpse ready to go into, and you get this sense that these guys are kind of their ferrymen, come to sort of, drag him off. And there's a sort of similarity in the endings, I just thought, with this. And when we talked about Glengarry, Glen Ross, there was similarities with Death of a Salesman. Of course, at the end of Death of a Salesman, Willie Loman drives off in a car. You just hear the sound of him driving away.
Heartbreaking play.
And he drives away to kill himself so they can cash the life insurance and the family can get some money. And then also it's a bit like at the end of the film Performance, where Chaz is kind of has kind of lost his mind as well, and he's driven away in a car. It's like this sort of hearse, in a way.
Yes, and this is true, by the way. What I'm about to say, this isn't a joke. Mr. D is very keen for us to do a live stream performance of the birthday party, because there's only a few characters, and
get Poe the person to play Lulu, and get their daughter of Albion to play Lulu, maybe.
All right, who's going to play Meg?
We'll have to think about that.
Yeah.
All right. But yeah, he's really quite keen to do that, and I am as well. I would like to get that set up if we could at some point. That sounds fun.
it's kind of interesting that seeing the end as the hearse had never occurred to me. Do you know when I used to teach this? As the students would come into the class, I'd get a newspaper, and I do that thing with McCann ripping the newspaper.
Yeah, tearing it into strips.
I just be doing that as they file in. What a I don't know. I thought it was a fun class.
Yeah.
Anyway,
there's that scene where Goldberg isn't there, and he's just sat alone in the middle of the room, tearing a newspaper into strips, just slowly, and then Stanley comes in, and he goes, "Sit down, Weber."
So, Pharaoh, why don't we? Is there anything else about the birthday party?
There's a thing I tied into. There's an interesting thing here because a couple of weeks ago, I think Mr. D mentioned the psychiatrist Ronnie Lang, R.D. Lang, who was sort of active at this time, and actually, I think he knew and got on with Pinter, and he actually had said, Ronnie Lang, that Pinter's plays were the perfect example of what he called the schizophrenic family. Because the famous thing about Ronnie Lang was he was a kind of part of what you call now the anti-psychiatry movement. And his famous experiment was where he tried to treat schizophrenics in mental hospitals without medication or electroconvulsive therapy. And he theorized that essentially, it was an unsuccessful experiment. He took some women from a Glasgow mental hospital, just listened to them for a month and then discharged them because they seemed to have got better. And he theorized that schizophrenia was induced or prompted by the nature of the dysfunctional family and its effects on people. And so there was this sense in which he was positing the idea that it was a kind of response, schizophrenia, to very unnatural and difficult and dysfunctional family situations. And this idea of the fragmentation of the individual is something that you've got the parallel in the birthday party, this sort of breaking down of the individual within the domestic space. And they say at the end of the play, frankly, it's a nervous breakdown, that he's having. But Lang was, as I say, was sort of more or less contemporaneous with what was going on here, and he was very much in his way. He was called the Pinter of psychiatrists because he did a lot of work with just sitting with people, holding silence, and trying to, understand how it was the pressures of society around them that was making them ill, and that's kind of a sort of a theme in the birthday party.
Yeah, I mean, I've always thought that Pinter, in some strange respects, resists psychologizing and resists, you talked about your trouble as an actor getting into the characters and so on.
Yeah.
I think in some ways they are deliberately designed to kind of repel all that.
Yes. I think that was more of a parallel, really, than a thing that Pinter. It was just happening at the time. I think there was a lot of, in the Cold War, questioning where sort of governments were summoning a new suspicion of the individual and thinking about how to control the mind of the individual. And these were just parallel developments.
There is one last thing I should mention is that I always thought that if I was to pair Pinter with anybody, Michel Foucault would always come to mind.
You think so?
Yeah, well, yes, and let me explain my reasoning for that. In Foucault, so in the classical kind of Marxist power studies, power, right, was always a state. It was between the state and the person underneath, right? It was a top-down thing where you had to consider the overarching structure and then your single node, you as the individual underneath it. Okay, the crushing weight of the state upon the person. So if you can imagine like the big ideology, and then the little person underneath. Whereas in Foucault, the power relations occur between all of the individuals as well. So it's not just the big state and the individual. It's the relationship between me and you, between you and Pharaoh, so they're all, if you can imagine all the little arrows, they all point to each other. Okay, so wherever you get two people, so in Foucault, wherever you get two people, there's a power relation. Okay, but also when two people speak to each other, you get discourse. You can imagine the two people are now connected by discourse. Okay, and that discourse also is charged with a power relation. Where there is discourse, there is power. Where there is knowledge, there is power. Where there are people, there is power. And it seems to me that in Pinter, in this play and in all his other plays, whenever two characters are on stage talking to each other, there is a power dynamic going on. Like so with Stanley and Meg, there's a power relation. With Goldberg and McCann, there's a power relation. Whenever you get any bit of dialogue, there is a power game going on as well, and that's why I thought that Foucault is particularly useful when breaking down Pinter. I don't necessarily think that Pinter was Foucauldian in his philosophy or whatever,
but you think it accords.
In terms of the power relations, I think there's a similar view of how power works on an interpersonal level in Pinter as there is in Foucault. Yeah.
Just before we move on, one just personal anecdote about Harold Pinter. So Harold Pinter was actually in person. He was quite an unpleasant chap, and he was. I mean, maybe it was kind of growing up as a sort of working class Jew in London in the 30s or whatever, but he was very much known to be quite pugnacious, among other things. And my father has a story that one night, I think it was in the late 70s, he was in quite a nice part of London attending a club, and somebody had brought Harold Pinter along as a guest, and by the time my father arrived there, Harold Pinter was very drunk and was being basically dragged out for fighting. And my dad came in and saw Harold Pinter there pinning this girl against the wall and screaming things. And he said, what the hell are you doing? That's no way to behave. And Harold Pinter went to my father and he went, "Do you want one? Do you want one, do you?" And then he had to be pulled away.
Wow.
So yeah, he's he also tried he tried a similar thing with Brian Blessed. Brian Blessed knocked him flat on his ass with one punch from the right hand because he's Brian Blessed. So.
I didn't know Harold Pinter was fighty. That's interesting.
He was very fighty. He was notorious for it.
He did a bit of work as a bouncer apparently at one time. Weirdly, he had a succession of odd jobs, like being a waiter, a postman, and there was another one who had said he was a snow clearer. They're all kind of jobs where they're sort of quite physical, but you don't say much.
Yeah,
and you sort of he had this. He was obsessed with cricket as well, and I found this interesting quote because it relates to, the way that you have in this play again. It's like Glengarry Glen Ross has a sort of violence of language that's sort of exteriorized. With Pinter, the violence kind of goes literally inside the individual. It kind of sort of penetrates and attacks the individual. And Pinter had this thing. He said he approved of the urban and exacting idea of cricket as a bold theatre of aggression. So it's the idea of this very restrained sort of scenario that allows you to portray this intense violence. And he kind of loved that idea of that containing of energy.
I'll just say very quickly as well, there's one thing that I've been interested in is actually the difference between let's say somebody from Harold Pinter's background, let's just say the London Jew, right, as compared with the Brooklynites, because they do seem to have quite a different temperament and
very different
aesthetic and personality, and it's something I've noticed more and more actually, because as I was going back through some of that footage, Simon, I don't know if you noticed I included scenes from Performance, Nicholas Roeg's Performance, and of course the mob boss in that is Jewish, but it's that it's a very different flavor of individual, I think, that you get from. Where were they based? North London, famously, wasn't it?
Who was that in the film?
No. The Jews of London. They had a
district. Green.
Pinter was from Hackney. I mean, nowadays it's kind of Stamford Hill, where a lot of the Orthodox Jews come from. But obviously the East End in Pinter's day was the context, and you did have. Obviously, especially in showbiz, of course, and clubs and things like that, you had a lot of, gentlemen who sort of, trod that line between being, upbeat, friendly, and diplomatic, and being quite tough nuts as well. And you see that, like, in performance, with the boss there. He's obviously a gang boss, but he has to be kind of sort of, oddly affable in a way, and
yes. But if you relocate that action to America, like, I mean, if you think of the famous depictions, often the Jewish character would be like, what's that film with is it In Carlito's Way, where he's like the little Sean Penn character there. He's like he's like an accountant or a lawyer or something like that.
What they call a nebbish kind of Jew, yeah.
Yes, and often they take that sort of role when you relocate the action to America, rather than here where he's actually the mob boss. If that makes any sense. So, the Sean Penn lawyer, exactly. Anyway, shall we move on from Birthday Party Pharaoh to your first pick, which is art? Is that right?
Yeah. So I did wonder if you guys would choose the classics. So what I've tried to do with my selections is to do a trio of more recent picks that I wanted to recommend. So if anyone does see them, to definitely jump on them.
I have seen this play, by the way. I saw it when it was in the West End, like, isn't it?
It was massively successful, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think it was in the mid 2000s when they did a run. I can't remember exactly when it was, but
it's down at the Old Vic. Before
I feel like I saw this cast actually. I think is that the Allam Partridge sidekick guy?
Everybody did art. I mean, everybody did a run in art. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like that's the one I saw. But let's continue. Let's continue.
But yeah, again, we probably saw the same thing. This is Old Vic before they've turned bad, basically. I did want to chat about like the modern state of theatre, but maybe we should save that for another day. But if you want to just scroll down, I've got a little introduction and synopsis. So yeah, it's actually originally a French language play by Yasmina Reza. So she's quite famous for doing the God of Carnage, or they did a film adaptation called Carnage. I saw Poe in chat mention that she saw that recently, funny enough, but I don't really like it that much, Carnage. And it was written in 1996 as well. So just in terms of the synopsis on the next slide, it's the story of three friends, really, and basically one of the friends, Serge, decides to buy a new piece of art, this kind of like abstract modernist work, and we'll see what it looks like in a second. And essentially, this purchase creates a lot of discussion within the trio of friends. They're kind of really old friends that meet up occasionally, but they haven't met for a little while. And essentially, this work of art becomes like a focal point for discussion about aesthetics, about the modern world, but also about themselves, leading to a bust up. And essentially the kind of the bust up climaxes in Mark, who is one of the guys who is most against the modern work, defaces it live. So it basically if you scroll down a second, you can see what the work of art looks like. It's literally a white canvas with some white lines on top of it. So, and I think
I should say, by the way, I remember the play being very funny in performance. It's a funny play.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of light-hearted, and it's not too not too serious. So in the version that I saw, they defaced it by Mark drew a guy who's skiing down a mountain, basically. So but basically everyone finds it quite funny in the end, and they sort of make up and they manage to wash away the pen. And I guess the kind of reason why I chose it was it's in my mind, we kind of mentioned about the specific format of theatre, and I do think these kind of what I would call kind of intense conversations only really work on a stage, because as soon as you take it to a novel or even film. If you were to have like some of the dialogue in that lasts a scene, it really drags. And again, I think with today's modern audiences, they just couldn't take a 30-minute discussion about the state of modern art and friendship itself. So it leans heavily on the theatre's strongest points. Obviously, because of my kind of interest in aesthetics as well, it's quite I don't really know the political affiliation of Yasmina, but there's some quite good zingers in there as well. I think if you maybe scroll down a couple of slides, I've got a quote in there a second. Here we go. So this was Mark talking about the painting in the state of contemporary art. I don't believe in the values which dominates contemporary art, the rule of novelty, the rule of surprise. Surprise is dead meat surge. No sooner conceived than dead. And obviously they're talking about the artwork, but they're also talking about it's kind of like a meta-analysis of the theatre itself. You don't really have very many cultural mediums of one form critiquing others. So I thought that was quite unique, and also this is quite a based take on modern art as well.
Because a lot of this was coming on the back of the YBAs. I mean, if only we had Mr. D here to talk about this, but I remember the Sensation exhibition in 1997 at the Royal Academy, and obviously there was a lot of disquiet, let's say, about the evaluation of conceptual art that came out of that, the apparent nothingness of some of the items, or the non-artisticness of items like sharks cut in half in a tank, or Tracy Emin's unmade bed, or some of the Ron Muick sculptures and things like that, where they certainly weren't 2D canvas based arts, and yet they became immensely successful and made millions of pounds for the people who conceived of them. And there was this, as I say, the disquiet in the early part of the century about, well, what has art come to? What is it for? What does it evaluate? What does it reflect back to us? And this play, I think, was kind of riding on that sort of sentiment at the time.
I think, interestingly, the whole art scene has sort of moved on beyond kind of shock, and this is the kind of the penultimate stage before the rise of activist art, and that's what it shifted to. So it's interesting, this kind of shock jock. It's about surprise, and it doesn't really have any meaning. It's just about getting attention. Then makes way for art with meaning, but just like demonic meaning instead, or like horrific leftist nonsense constantly. So it's interesting. This is obviously of a time and in a specific moment.
There was something about a kind of blandness of middle class preoccupations there as well, wasn't there?
Like basically some of the undercurrents was that Serge had sort of gone off to, like, he'd sort of reached a higher echelon of society, and he, like, previously his tastes weren't really interested in contemporary art, and this is kind of one of the reasons why that Mark's kind of calling him out as a bit of a hypocrite. But he was recommended it by some of his new friends. So you've got this idea of the friendship group that has known each other for a long time, and one person is becoming more, affluent and more interested in something different and changing, while the other two are very much kind of stuck in their similar lives. So again, it's an interesting critique on class as well. I often think about AA when you talk about some of your, meeting up with friends and not having much to say with them anymore. I sometimes have that with old friends as well, where you just moved on to such a different place, and they're exactly the same people as you as they were when they were 16 or whatever. So
I imagine AA's friendship group looks quite like this, actually. That's you on the sofa at the left.
Him on the left, yeah.
Sort of bored.
I will just say, do you remember I mentioned N.F. Simpson earlier on? I don't know if what's her name, Yasmina Reza, would have even been aware of this play, but the whole setup of art where you have this object essentially, or this thing, this blank canvas, that is the springboard for wider musings. Reminds me of an N.S. Simpson play called The Hole. I don't know if you're aware of this play.
No.
Basically, there's a hole in the road, and these two people like stop and like consider what its meaning is, and slowly over the course of the play, like many people gather around and talk about like what this hole could mean. It's an absurdist play from the 50s, you know, but it kind of you know, there's a bit of that. Also, J.B. Priestley, who I mentioned earlier on. Do you remember I talked about the device of the stranger who comes in? He has another play called Dangerous Corner, where there's this music box that serves as a catalyst that basically like ends up destroying the lives and the relationships of all the characters in the play because of I don't know how it manages to do this, but it does. And there is a little bit of that as well, where this painting serves as a catalyst for, you know, things to happen between the characters, essentially. So, yes, just thought I'd mention those two things.
The only other interesting thing I thought was worth mentioning was around, again, like friendship dynamics. And both Mark and Serge are very opinionated. They're very vocal. And then the third guy, whose name I forget, who's kind of like more like a bit of a wet blanket, has got relationship problems, is kind of used as a pawn to kind of back each other up. So Mark kind of rolls them out at the start and says, you know, what do you think? It's like his name's like Yuri or something like that. You know, what do you think? And he says, yeah, I don't really understand it. So he feels like he's kind of won. And I quite like that, like look into how, again, friendship groups work. And again, you tend to have these kind of strong figures, and then the weaker people you kind of almost used as pawns in arguments.
Do you remember there was a character in the Far Show who was like that? Was he called like Indecisive Dave or something? But he was always like two people were having a debate and he disagreed with whoever was speaking. And it would get him into trouble because then they try to hold him to something he'd agreed to earlier on. Weirdly, there's a bit of that in the Arenal in Glengarry Glen Ross, where he just happens to listen to what Moss is saying,
and he bamboozles him
into
an
accomplice, you know.
Because
so
he listened.
There's an interesting thing, like passive characters, I guess you'd call them, you know. But you do get that. I mean, I had a friend who was very kind of he would appease a lot, you know. He just go along with whatever anybody else was doing, you know.
And that was very much a theme of Pinter's as well, is this passivity in the face of authority. You know, these people who just sort of come into a room without any apparent source of authority, but then start to try and control the narrative and the situation and you know, with menace.
Just riffing off that, as an aside, there was like a Reddit screenshot going around Twitter the other day talking about how this woman was outraged about men hiding their political values and kind of revealing them like quite far down like a relationship. And I thought that was interesting in terms of this kind of passivity where men are now sort of having to hide what they believe in or basically have no opinions until way down in a relationship. So they have to almost have this passive nature taught to them at the same time. But anyway, that is my play. I don't know, AA, if you want to do one of yours.
Okay. Why don't we do? I think it might be best to do Osborne, are the three that I mentioned. Just because it was a major turn in British theatre, because it was focused, like I said, on the working class, and I actually think there's a political element to it, which so Osborne is identified with this group of writers who became known as the Angry Young Men. Weirdly, Jonathan Bowden had an interest in this group because he had a friend called Bill Hopkins who is identified as one of them, you know. But Osborne was seen as kind of voicing a lot of the frustrations of the young generation of the 1950s who'd come after the Second World War, who were basically experiencing a Britain in serious decline, having expended a lot of money on the Second World War. The empire was collapsing. There was unemployment. There was very few job prospects. They put the massive welfare state in under Attlee, and generally it was quite a grim time, the 1950s, to be British.
Yes.
Unlike in America, which has great nostalgia for the 50s, the 50s in the Britain was a very different experience.
I was reading about the other day, talking about life after the war. Everybody agreed that it was actually worse to live in Britain after the war than it was during the during the Great Depression before it.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Anyway, John Osborne was was probably the lead, the main face of the angry young men. I mean, there were other ones. There was a woman, Sheila Delaney. There's a guy called Arnold Wesker, who's a bit more kind of socialist. And there are various other ones as well. But this one, Look Back in Anger, was the kind of first one, and it was the kind of the head, the head of the spear, if you want, the spearhead. And it's kind of interesting because the main character in the play is a guy called Jimmy Porter. There's two versions that you can watch. There's one starring Richard Burton, and there's one starring Kenneth Branagh, where they relocate the action to the 80s. It's now like it's a Thatcher's Britain Look Back in Anger as opposed to a 1950s one. They're both worth watching, I would say. And basically, he's got this. He's a working class lad, but his wife, Alison, is from the upper middle classes, and she's very passive. We'll just put it that way. She's kind of doesn't really say much, and she's a bit kind of beaten down. And then the only other characters in the play are there's a Welsh bloke who's a lodger or something, right? Cliff, who just happens to be around. Another quite passive character, and then there's is there anyone else in the play? That I think there's another woman, isn't there?
Yeah, there's a friend of the wife who's like
the actress
who's a snob, sort of.
Yeah, and then weirdly, Alison's father, I would say, is a major character in the play without actually being in the play. Jimmy just talks about him a lot, and he's like a bit of a, what do they call, like a Colonel Blimp type. He's stuck in the 1930s. He can't get over. He's basically just like an Edwardian, or
he's end of the Raj kind of character. He's got a great little speech. I used to know, I think the last day the sun shone was when that dirty little train steamed out of that crowded, suffocating Indian station with the battalion band playing for all it was worth. I knew in my heart it was all over then, everything. And he's kind of this mournful elegy for lost empire.
A fantastic reactionary character, I would say.
Yeah.
So the thing is that the play is basically one long rant by Jimmy Porter.
Yes.
In fact, I used to say, I can't believe I used to say this when I used to teach his play, but he reminds me of PJW more than any other person. If anybody in the modern world is Jimmy Porter, it's PJW, right?
Talks about the mainstream media.
Imagine PJW just ranting for 2 hours.
Being in a relationship with him.
Right, and it's basically
lodging with him.
Imagine you were living with PJW, only he's ranting at you, not at the YouTube screen or whatever. He's just ranting at you all day long, every day, about the state of the modern world and so on. And what interests me about the play is that the concerns that Jimmy Porter has are not necessarily what you might say, quote unquote, left wing ones. I think there are deep reactionary elements in John Osborne in general, and in this play. And I've always been a little bit interested in how, on various kind of university syllabi and reading this, and this is one that manages to sneak through that. I mean, I wouldn't say it's like straightforwardly a right-wing text, but I would say it's got strong reactionary elements.
Yeah.
And that interests me in general, because it's a little peek into the mindset of the average Brit, basically, in the 1950s, and where it's like there is a kind of inchoate rage about it all. Like sometimes he rants for the sake of ranting, But the fact of the matter is that he's pissed off and he knows that something's not right,
Just to bring up a point about these kind of Colonel Blimp type characters, because there's quite a few of them in his plays. And in Look Back in Anger, I think his name's Colonel Redfern, the father of Alison. He's not portrayed as somebody you're meant to dislike. He's actually very sympathetic. He's kind of hopelessly kind of lost. Like, he really is from kind of 1890 as opposed to 1950. But he's you're not meant to hate him, and he is good natured. And the other one that springs to mind is the older man in The Entertainer, who was like an Edwardian music hall performer who had a lot of success in his day, but again, he's kind of lovable, but completely unable to kind of deal with or cope with the changes that have happened to society since then.
And as AA suggests, that the thing that especially Jimmy Porter is kind of hankering for, it's not what you might expect at this point, that he's looking forward to a kind of youthful rebellion and a sort of embracing a boomer truth regime kind of reaction. He's actually, I think he has a speech, doesn't he, about it's kind of like a kind of, we was too young, we missed out on the war, and you had your war, and now there are no great causes to die for. You might as well just fall under a bus,
I mean, it's the play is called Look Back in Anger, right? Look Back in Anger. And it's very, there's a great sense of a loss of status, loss of empire, a loss of what it means to be British. There's a creeping American imperialism in the play, which is resisted, by Jimmy. He does have class resentment as well.
Yes, he does.
Towards his wife. And I mean, these days you'd say, well, many aspects of that relationship are just straightforward domestic abuse, basically. But he is a bit of a troll as well. He's looking for any sort of reaction at all, and it doesn't matter if it's a laugh or if it's to make her cry. He's trying to shake her out of her indifference.
Yes.
Like, fucking just believe anything.
I mean, the opinion of Bowden was that it was one of the more explicitly right-wing plays, and his whole strain of plays was actually a very right-wing or reactionary force in theatre. That a lot of the time it's kind of claimed without thinking by the left, but actually it's really not leftist in any way. It's not progressive in any way. It's a very angry, full-throated sort of like, things are kind of shit now, and they used to be good.
and I mean, I do think that there is a way of seeing Alison's passivity as a kind of more general passivity.
Yes.
And his basic point is, both to Alison and that Welsh bloke, is like, why the fuck don't you care about these things?
Mm-hmm.
Why don't you're just prepared to carry on with your ironing board or whatever else? Like, have something about you, for God's sake.
He's a bit like Johnny in the Mike Leigh film Naked, 30, 40 years later, isn't he? You're not really living in some way.
I should say that it's worth doing. I won't pull them up now, but if you're interested in John Osborne, it's worth just pulling up his interviews with various different journalists at the time, because he was very hostile to the media, and he was like, even though they say angry young man and working class, he's very well spoken, at least by today's standards, right? And he's a very arch character, and he's just an interesting guy. It's just very interesting to watch his interviews, and to see how the media were with him and how he was with them. I'm always interested by those artists who have an openly hostile relationship with journalists. I mean, Bob Dylan, who we talked about before, has always been hostile with media as well. But to see it happening in the late 1950s, early 60s is interesting. We should mention, by the way, that didn't Laurence Olivier help out? I think Laurence Olivier was quite instrumental in helping get both this play and The Entertainer put on at all.
Yeah, he was hugely involved. I think he fronted money. I think he had a lot of influence with producers and various people that could get it made. And basically, I think he was the force behind it. I think on the proviso that he could play the lead in the film, I think.
Because Olivier was at a point in his career where, I mean, this is the thing when we talked about favourite actors at the beginning, and I always felt odd liking Olivier because he's often seen, I guess, by people now as a very mannered style of acting. And he was very conscious at that point where he was getting into his middle age. He'd made his bones, he'd done his big films and his big shows, but he was aware that the ground was sort of shifting under his feet. And, people like Brando and, Jimmy Dean were coming onto the scene, and American naturalism was making its way into the public consciousness. And he felt he very much had to kind of pivot in some way to sort of access the energy of this new naturalism that was being, refined by, in Britain, people like the kitchen sink dramatists. And I think that's why he consciously invested in that to sort of change his acting product, so to speak, and move into, to show people he could do naturalistic as well as, putting on false noses and, somersaulting off balconies like he used to do in the 30s, very different kinds of performance.
One thing I wanted to bring up about the play was the staging, and something we haven't really talked about, because the couple of times I've seen it, it's often been very cramped on stage. They purposely put the actors very close together to kind of echo the stifling nature. I don't know if you had any comments about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, this room that is closing in is a huge part of the kitchen sink realism, I guess, where you're kind of the single room setting becomes a kind of prison, I guess. Yes, you're right about that. I just wanted to mention very quickly as well that one of the most ridiculous pieces of criticism ever written by Kenneth Tynan, where he says, he said in his review of the play, "I doubt if I could ever love anyone who did not wish to see it look back in anger." I mean, that's imagine a reviewer writing. So I always thought that was a funny thing.
I've got a terrible confession to make, but I was in the relationship where I was like that, and I was with someone like that. I was sort of young and chippy and energetic, and she was someone who was kind of upper middle class and very passive, and it did work out like that. It was horrible. I was an arsehole. Sorry.
You were Jimmy. Are you saying you were Jimmy Porter?
Yeah, I didn't. I thought I watched, because I hadn't actually seen the play until you'd mentioned it, and I went and watched the Burton version. And I thought I knew what sort of kitchen sink drama was going to be about, but then I found it becoming very uncomfortable to watch, because I realized that played out very much like this particular relationship I had, and I was kind of angry at the person for being passive.
He's literally me.
Yeah.
What do you think? I mean, I think it's an interesting thing to tease out a little bit. What do you think it is? But what do you think the specific anger at the upper middle class would be from somebody of your background or somebody from Jimmy Porter's background?
Gosh, I mean, I think this was the irritation I had in this relationship. Was she was always wanting to kind of be experiencing things in an authentic way, And I'd come from, Hartlepool, which is a horrible working class town in the northeast. I won't make any lies about that. And as I say, we lived, in when I was kids, their houses were like the ones in the birthday party. They were horrible, and it wasn't nice. And you didn't want to be kind of poor. And I met her, and it was kind of like an odd chalk and cheese situation. And she was very, very, very well off. Her father was a property developer, and it kind of introduced me to sort of seeing a glimpse of a lifestyle that we just had no hope of achieving. And yet at the same time, she wanted to kind of run her fingers through the dirt of other people's lives, and almost made a kind of fetish of a kind of lifestyle pornography about wanting to go and live in poor countries and and live a kind of edgy kind of existence. And I'd say, look, you don't get it. You don't want to be poor. It's nice being rich. It's nice having money and having a comfortable middle class lifestyle. What's your problem? But she felt a deep sort of insecurity about it, and it sort of came out in that way of her kind of sort of shutting up and not offering anything back. And I was constantly kind of raging at things. I had my own chips on my shoulders at that time, from my family upbringing.
I knew some girls. I actually knew some girls like this at university who I was good friends with, but I you know how I always give people little nicknames and things. I've always done that, obviously, and I used to call them the bourgeoisie, right? As a collective, there were three girls. They used to live together, and then I won't tell you their real names, but let's just pretend one of them was called Laura and one of them was called Lucy. Okay, they'd be bourgeois Lucy and bourgeois. What did I say? Bourgeois Laura, right? And I would always consistently insert bourgeois before I, but they were very much like that. I mean, one of them. It's almost like a kind of parody stereotype of what you'd imagine. She I think her dad was like a multimillionaire. We went to her house once, and they had huge fireplace, and it was basically a mansion. I remember once we were this girl was rich. I remember once we were coming through the I was looking at like an uncut magazine. Remember we were talking about that before, Simon? And I was just kind of looking at it on the rack, and she just picked it up and bought it and just said, "Oh yeah, here you go." She used to do stuff like that. But anyway, after we left university, she went to Africa. She ended up marrying some like local African guy.
Oh,
you can imagine how that turned out. I think they were divorced within like a month or something. But it's stuff like that. Yeah, very much this fetishism of seeing how the other half live, as it were. So yeah, I can.
People in the chat making a reference to the Pulp song, saying, "I want to live like colored
people." I was going to start singing the lyrics, but I didn't have a chance.
Yeah,
just one kind of musing, just riffing on the kind of role of the wife, because again, if you read it as like a working class critique and rage at what's happened to England and Britain for the last 40 years, the role of the wife is the kind of like existing elite or the upper middle class whose role it is to guide things and they literally have this kind of feminine passive role that doesn't do anything or doesn't say anything, that just carries on like nothing's wrong. And so I always thought of it that her character is to represent the existing elite, or while the only people that are kind of standing up to this kind of horrific change are the working class. So
they're aware of the managed decline.
There is strange sort of passive acceptance among a certain generation of upper middle class people. I would say the ones that I've known, or the ones that I do know, where they're just kind of not concerned about, it's just, well, why didn't you care?
And it's worn as a badge of kind of faux sophistication, isn't it? It's people saying, well, change is natural, change happens. You've got to learn to deal with change, Simon. Why? Yeah, why does this change have to happen?
Or even more disingenuous. Oh, it was ever thus type thing.
Yeah.
Oh, these things come and go. It's like, what are you fucking talking about? Wake up!
Yeah.
So I do understand that impetus from Jimmy Porter. the kind of rage that you feel. Because I mean, I have never had that sort of I've not, unlike Simon, I never actually had like an Alison Porter or that sort of relationship, but it does kind of, I do find the passivity mystifying. I just don't get it.
I think there was a desire in me to live sort of intensely in the way that he was describing, and the thing about it, this is kind of when I got into acting in a way. I sort of I sort of accidentally got into it at school when we sort of had to play out a scene one day from. We had a fantasy novel called The Wizard of Earthsea that we read, and there was a scene in which some sort of peasants in this fantasy scenario were being raided by some kind of marauder characters, and I found the whole thing quite exciting, and I felt it sort of initiated something in me that said, you want to live a life that's more interesting, like where things like this happen, where people are trying to kill you, instead of living the life you're actually living. So it was very much that thing of where's my war kind of thing.
Just one last thing I wanted to say on this. I think interestingly, it's sort of come around again because just in terms of its relevance, because again in the 50s, you've got the kind of end of empire, the end of Britain as a global superpower, effectively. So you've got all of this power taken away, and I think the age that we're living in is something very similar, where even Britain itself and our own past and legacy has been taken away. Do you know what I'm saying? So in the 50s, it was this kind of broader global thing, and now even the meager scraps that we have are taken away. And I think that's why you have the rise of your PJWs, these kind of, again, these angry people shouting out at this last loss.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things to consider with that is that for a period like in the 90s, and when I very first studied this play when I was in university and so on, it had seemed to have lost relevance, to be very much of its time. Whereas, as you're saying, Pharaoh, now it's come out of that and now it's relevant again. Even though the specific concerns may be different, there is a lot of parallel there. Only the difference is now is that no West End play, no West End theatre is giving a voice to John Osborne or Jimmy Porter or any working class playwrights, because they're all fucking owned by Disney. Right?
Exactly. Because it's a threat.
So I don't know what you want to do, because I don't think we're going to get round all these plays. Pharaoh, should we call an audible here?
Well, I was going to suggest. I know there's probably other plans, but since we talked about Look Back in Anger, should we touch on The Entertainer?
Yeah, we might as well tack on The Entertainer
if we have time,
because it's his next play. We might as well talk about it now. So.
Sure.
Well, I mean, AA, this is a favorite of yours, isn't it? The Entertainer.
Yeah, because I love
the derelict, the faded.
I also love the man. I also love the kind of clinging on to a dying or almost dead tradition, because there's something haunting about it. It's something.
Terrifying,
it's like they're in the 60s, but they're literally reaching all the way back to the Victorian era.
Yes,
and those people would have been around. It's one of the things. It's why I love stuff like Steptoe and Son and things like that as well, because it's just like, and the thing is that now all of that stuff seems a very long way away. But when I was like in the 80s, you'd still see like there was still a ragamuffin man around. There was this odd.
There still is where I live.
in our town, there was this odd kind of like antique shop. It's long closed now, and there was this weird like little family living in there. They had no electricity. They'd huddle around a coal-fired stove that had been there, and it was just like you'd still see this like weird holdover of the Victorian era, even in the 1980s. We're talking like 100 years later, and there were still remnants of that old world.
Yeah,
the very last dregs of it. Now that's long gone. I mean, anything that was left over was destroyed by Blair, of course.
That's true. That was really the last gasp. I mean, so we should start by saying this is another play set in a rundown seaside town. Although this isn't sort of like a small town, this is more like a sort of Blackpool-esque sort of like, or more like a sort of Margate esque sort of town. Sort of, it's a bit bigger, and there's more of a kind of there's more people around, and it's got a kind of slightly more urban feel to it. And it's about this chap called Archie Rice, who is he owns and runs a local music hall. And for anybody that doesn't know, the music hall was a late Victorian / Edwardian institution in all over the country. Every town in the country had one. And what it was like a nightly variety thing. So every day of the week, every night, you could go to the music hall. There'd be a bar as well. You'd have drinks. And there would just be a constant stream of variety acts. There would be people would come on and do a dance, and they would sing, and there would be comedians, and there would be little sketches and things. If you've ever seen the Muppet Show, or you've looked at the streams we did, that it's basically that, just this constant stream of people who act and sing. There were lots of buxom ladies, singing cheeky songs, and the audience would be kind of raucous and drunk, and it became a kind of institution, and there were kind of some hit songs that came out of it. It also was towards the end of up to the First World War, it became a kind of political institution, and politicians would go and speak in music halls and things, and kind of especially kind of imperialist ones like Joe Chamberlain, who used to give speeches in the music hall, to sort of, we're going to conquer South Africa, and they would go, oh, and that kind of thing. But anyway, this institution faded away after the First World War, partly because of the introduction of the cinema, and also sort of more home-based entertainment came along. By the 50s, it was a really gone thing. I mean, nobody wanted to go to the music hall anymore. It was seen as this kind of very old-fashioned, way far gone form of entertainment. A lot of them started to just, if they weren't closed already, they'd become, horrifically derelict and bankrupt. And by the time this play was set, I think this play is set in like 1962. No, it's early.
It was written in 1957.
1957. But it's like the idea of a music hall still keeping itself up in as late as that is kind of absurd. And the chap who runs it, Archie Rice, it's actually implied that he could have been a lot more. He could have done more. He could have gone and made a career for himself. But he stuck to the music hall. Basically, he decided to stick to it and ride it out.
Apparently, the largest chain of British music hall was owned by Moss Empires. They closed down in 1960. So that the very final death knell seems like it was in the early 60s. So
yes.
Osborne's writing this play right in the dying.
Yeah, it's about there's only a few left, and they don't do very well. Yes, and also his father is a retired music hall star, who we touched on earlier. He was a successful music hall performer of his day, which was sort of like 1905, 1910 sort of era. That was when he was around, and I think his son is fighting in Korea. I think he has a son who's in Korea, it's just this horrifically depressing play, absolutely just haunting. And you get these kind of cuts. So it cuts from their home where he lives with his second wife and his daughter and the retired father. And then it cuts to him every night at the music hall doing his kind of comic patter. And he sings like jingoistic songs about the empire from like sort of 1902. And it's really sad. And it's implied that there's like three people in the audience, but he has this kind of almost like psychopathy to him. He's emotionless. Like his his family are crying and they're falling apart, and the daughter's depressed, and no one knows what they're doing, and he doesn't care. He just does this thing where he starts like telling jokes and starts performing whenever anybody tries to sort of have a serious emotional sort of chat, and he drinks a lot and he lies to people, and then there's a famous line in it where his daughter comes and tells him that his son has been killed in the war, and he's got into this scheme that's just fallen through, and the music hall is going to go bust, and there isn't going to be a show anymore. And he just goes, "Look at these eyes. I'm dead behind these eyes. Like I can't bring myself to care anymore." It's horrible, really, but it's haunting. The sort of there's a haunting quality to it.
There's a couple of things I'll mention. Is that I think one of the tropes that comes out of this play that is then later picked up that people may know about is the idea of the performer on the empty stage with just the spotlight and there's nobody there. I think that's picked up in The King of Comedy, and then of course in Joker, much more recently. I don't know if they directly took it from The Entertainer, but the trope, I would say, comes from there, and it's very haunting. You know, being on the stage on your own. You know, the other thing is I as you know, I love the idea of somebody who's 20, 30 years past their prime still doing like extremely dated material. I love that. I just, whenever I get a chance, it's like kind of like Cannonball, only it's 1998, not 1978, or you know, I love to see it in pro wrestling as well, like the kind of you know, the Russian villain still trying to eke out the last embers of Cold War propaganda in like 1996 in a kind of half empty indie building in Louisiana or something. You know, it's just but the interesting thing about music hall in general and about this play is that it registers something that Bowden is interested in, which is the folk culture as opposed to the corporate pop culture or indeed the high culture.
Because
this is like a kind of
it's because it's referenced several times that the reason people aren't in the music halls anymore is because they're watching the movies and they're watching the TV. Basically, that it's taken it away. And in fact, there's a bit in the film, I can't remember if it's in the play, where Archie Rice puts up a sign with him on it outside the theater, and it says "as seen on TV," which is a lie, but he's doing it to kind of trick people, you know, because of course he's kind of playing into this idea that, well, if he was on the telly, as they say, then he must have been a success, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, we should mention that there's a long tail to the music hall. It's like, well, all the theatres closed down, but a lot of people who then went on to have a huge influence in British popular culture had a musical back. I mean, most famously, someone like Bruce Forsyth, right?
Morecambe Wise, Frankie Howard.
The Chuckle Brothers did, I know.
A lot of the Carry On crew would have been music hall stars in their day, you know.
Yes.
It's just that they went on to other things. But what's interesting about that is the hidden ways in which that music hall folk tradition sneaks into the popular culture through all of these characters who would have just been like repeating material that they used to do. You know, they used to have bits, didn't they? Well, a lot of, like, if you watch Kenneth Williams for long enough, he's just doing a lot of bits that he used to have on his cabaret act, but they sneak into like polite society through things like Just a Minute or you know, just widely distributed movies, or you know, even Bruce Forsyth on bloody Strictly Come Dancing a few years ago. Like, I mean, think of the different worlds that he was part of, that guy. And it kind of just somehow it's not a living, it's a dead tradition that then finds a new life in these other things. I find that very interesting.
But again, there's part of the subtext to Archie Rice is that yes, he could have done that. He could have been a Bruce, or he could have gone and sort of like made his career in London or on the television or whatever. But he has this kind of hopeless loyalty to the provincial music hall. He doesn't want to let it go. He can't really believe that it's gone, or he can't bring himself to until it's too late, and he's basically ruined his life and the lives of everyone around him. It's
vaudeville to the bone.
Yeah, he keeps singing all the songs about the empire and stuff. There's also that kind of subtext as well. This whole idea that it's not just the music halls; it's that entire concept of what Britain was is now just like rapidly just running out. Seems to be the theme.
Yeah, I mean, Ken Dodd endured as a kind of one-man act, didn't he?
Yeah,
he was like a one-man musical, essentially, wasn't he?
You had a weird thing where Frankie Howard actually did a sort of campus university tour, I think, in the sort of early 90s. You know, when you had people like, you know, the Mary Whitehouse experience going on with that kind of stadium comedy. I think Howard was sort of making a return to doing turns like, student unions.
There is a very, very debased form of it that goes on in, it's horrible kind of culture that is, but if you ever go on those like Ibiza holidays and so on, there are some awful remnants of it in there as well, but it's like, it's crude, I'm thinking about the Roy Chubby Brown type thing, there's a weird kind of fag end of it in there as well.
Do you think that sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, a couple of guys in chat have reminded me of have you ever seen the Good Old Days, which is kind of like a 70s revival of that, and I only heard about it like the last 5 years ago, but it's so 70s because everyone has to dress up like Victorians in it, but it's kind of like all done through the 70s lens. So all of the colours are kind of like turned up to 15, but it is quite an entertaining show at the same time. So
it was hugely popular at the time. I remember my parents used to watch things like that. It was very odd, as you say. It's just like a recreation of a night in a musical theatre, but not performed by actors as such. The audience, it's real people going to watch actual musical.
Even the Royal Variety performance,
a bit like that,
musical. They had that minstrel show on TV, famously,
black and white minstrel show, which was massively loved when it was going into the early 80s, I think.
So there was, clearly there was still an audience there for that sort of material. It was just stolen by the television.
I think it's not that people all of a sudden stopped liking comedy as such. It's just that as you say, people would rather sit in their living rooms with their close relatives and watch it as opposed to go out to the music hall. And there is a kind of so the music halls as they were actually a very male dominated crowd. And I believe most of the audience were men. Generally, the only sort of women you'd see in the audience of a sort of average, say, London town music hall were not nice girls, shall we say? They were there to pick up the clientele. And I remember reading an account of it where it said how the place was like so utterly stuffed with cigar smoke and pipe smoke, and the floor was covered in ash, and everybody would brawl, and it was all these sort of working men in shirt sleeves, spitting on the floor and grabbing each other, and this would all be happening while some sort of large lady on the stage was kind of giving it her all. It was a very kind of primordial blowing off steam institution in some ways. There were different examples to it. It wasn't all like that, but I think what happened was, of course, that when kind of working men and kind of the Victorian working class faded away, sort of in between the wars and especially after the Second World War, the market went out from under it. So of course, I think the women by that point would rather stay at home with their husbands and watch TV or see the flicks or something.
I'm. It's a little bit because there is this distinction, I would say, between folk culture and a kind of mass pop culture, right? But there is this, as you were saying, that these people were enormously popular.
They were.
And a lot of people who came out of that tradition sold millions of records. Like, I mean,
They did.
George Formby, Flanagan and Allen, even people like Clive Dunn, you know, from Dad's Army.
Yeah.
You know, he used to bring out novelty records. I mean, these things would hit number one on a regular basis. You know,
Bernard Cribbins,
Right
Said Fred, of course.
Yeah, I play that to AAA sometimes. Right Said Fred.
Benny Hill.
So, but what I'm saying is that even though these things were popular and they were part of the kind of quote unquote pop culture, they're clearly not. They're clearly a folk culture, and they're a glimpse into some indigenous real thing. I'm quite interested in that. I am genuinely quite interested in the difference between.
Yes, and I mean, if you view it from then up to now, it's kind of a slow process of the regime stamping it out in every form it takes until all you have now is like, you know, zombified Zoomers watching Love Island on a phone. You know, I mean, it's completely gone. I mean, look at the vicious attempt to stamp out the working men's club comedy because, of course, it was basically the only place where you could basically moan about all the immigrants and the you know women and sort of tell these kind of slightly sort of risque, but I think they felt in their hearts true jokes. And then that was replaced with that kind of really progressive, like clean sort of student right on, you know,
Ben Elton
alternative comedy. Yeah, you know, I mean, once you got that, it's completely corporate, completely progressive, completely kind of, you know, liberalified mass comedy. And the awful thing is to me is how much they've patted themselves on the back for that for about 40 years now. Like every year at Christmas, those programs run where they talk about how funny Blackadder was and how incredibly clever they all were for coming up with it. You know, it's quite sickening.
An experience to go back and watch actually is when Bernard Manning goes on Mrs. Merton, because I mean it's clearly set up as a hit job on him, right? But it's worth watching that show. I watched it in its entirety because I was considering doing a whole show on it, you know, as a kind of one of the initial moments of the all-encompassing PC culture. It was kind of interesting the extent to which that kind of backfired on Mrs. Merton, though, because of course Bernard Manning had his wits about him, you know.
Who was that other comedian like Bernard Manning who used to do the darts? Was it a darts show or a snooker show?
Yeah, Jim Davidson. He's still around.
Jim Davidson, that's right. Yeah. Sorry, go on.
He's still around. He's still around, causing trouble on Twitter.
It's only a game, so put up a real good fight. I'm going to be snookering you tonight. Right,
I mean, I remember him in the 70s watching him on the telly, and actually really, I liked him at the time. I mean, his favourite turn was when he did a West Indian bus driver called Chalky, and the accent and everything. And of course, I can't do it. I can't mention it. You know, I can't go there. But we all thought it was hilarious.
It is interesting though how these little bits of, I guess you'd call it social mobility, right? It's like, well, you know, if you look at John Osborne, he was a working class boy, and somehow he's putting on these plays in the West End, and somehow they'd broken through into the elite discourse and the elite culture, right? And I find it interesting the extent to which the regime has kind of put that back in its box. And if you think about Tony Blair's whole mission to send everybody to university, well, what is university? It's a kind of middle classification tool. Yeah. You take a working class,
the identity card of the middle class, basically.
Yeah, so if John Osborne had been sent to university, he would have been transformed basically into like he wouldn't have been able to have that authentic, if you want, working class voice. I also find it interesting how whenever the working class are given a voice, they are, as Pareto puts it, always class twos. You know, they are not progressives in that sense. Whenever they're allowed to have their say, whether it's in the comedy or in the musical or even in play form, you don't get the typical left-wing dross.
No.
Is there anything else we want to talk about, folks?
I've got to crowbar this in because I really want to. And this is because we did the birthday party and Glengarry Glen Ross, which was actually Panama Hut stole one of my choices anyway, so I only have one left. But I want to bring up something here because I'm very passionate about Shakespeare's history plays.
Mm-hmm.
And the history plays break down basically into what scholars you will know they call the minor and the major tetralogy. And the
first and second, please. The first and second.
Well, so I think there's something of a sniffiness about the plays that I love, which are the Henry VI plays up to Richard III. A lot of people lionize the Richard II, Henry IV, and Henry V, which are great plays and fantastic parts. But the Henry VIs don't often get a look in. And I think when I absolutely love these plays, but I think they're very germane to this channel because they are literally about the circulation of elites. There's
also some bozo, Simon, who wrote a book about the history plays. Can't think of who he was.
Yeah, it was some Iranian woman, wasn't it?
Yeah, some Iranian woman.
Very old.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to say something controversial. It will be controversial with you. It won't mean anything to anyone else.
Mm-hmm.
I actually like Henry VI parts 2 and 3 and have much less to say about part 1.
I saw this when I was looking across, scholarship about this, and people say it's the weak play, Henry VI part 1.
There's a lot of evidence to suggest either that Shakespeare didn't write it, or that he wrote it last, or it was shoehorned in at the start. All of that action is all about Joan of Arc, believe it or not, Henry VI part 1. And it does serve a useful purpose for the whole 8-play sequence, if you want to see them in that way, which is that Shakespeare had quite a romanticized view of the chivalric past, of a time of honor and order, right? And Henry VI part 1, perhaps more than any other play, kind of tries to gesture back towards an age where people had honor. There's a character called Duke Humphrey, who's quite prominent in it, I seem to recall.
Yeah.
And the fact that, whatever you make of Joan of Arc or whatever, at least these are people who are kind of, they're engaged in some higher purpose than just kind of raw Machiavellian power politics.
That's right.
And as the tetralogy, or as the trilogy, if you want, by the time you get to part 3, things have devolved greatly to the point where brothers are killing brothers, order is turned upside down, women are in charge, everything is turning to shit, basically. And this only happens a few times in Shakespeare. It happens in King Lear, happens in Titus Andronicus, and it happens in Henry VI part 3. This is 3 times where everything falls to pieces. And it's an absolute disaster. It's Shakespeare's nightmare, basically, Henry VI part 3.
And it is kind of charting that thing, as you say. I think it's Duke Humphrey. You're talking about Gloucester. He's the Lord Protector, isn't he? He's Henry V's uncle. So it's essentially the plays start. It's like Henry V has died suddenly. After the glories of Agincourt and the conquest of France, he's died, and then Shakespeare's saying what happens on the next day, and you find the infighting in the court begins, the factionalism. And you see the splintering of this group of elites, and you begin to see this the very things you've been talking about, in the way that you don't get. You see populist rebellion in the play, but of course, in fact, you discover it has in fact been, as you would say, completely engineered and supported top down. And
you're talking about Jack Cay's rebellion,
the Jack Cade rebellion.
An AstroTurf rebellion.
Yeah, Yeah, absolutely. It's all there, and I think there's just, I mean, they're brilliantly sort of muscular plays from the point of view of both language and action, and I think there's an element to which people are a bit sniffy about that. I think in scholarship, there's a classical notion of drama that action goes on off stage. You don't have violence on stage and fighting, and the Henry VI is seen as sort of immature works because of that.
I mean, just to give a bit of context, Henry VI plays were the Henry VI plays were some of Shakespeare's most popular plays in the day. You have to see them almost like Hollywood blockbusters. They sold out. They made huge amounts of money. That's how come he wrote sequels, and and this is why the second trilogy was written, because the first lot was so popular.
And this is the thing today, when you see them done, I mean, they're often staged as part of the cycle, at least as the Henry VI's and Richard III, and they're immensely popular when they're done today. And I mean, I don't know if it's known broadly, but apparently, George R.R. Martin based stole a lot of stuff for Game of Thrones from. I mean, I don't know Game of Thrones that well.
Yeah, I mean, Game of Thrones made teaching these plays a hell of a lot easier as well. I mean, there are many aspects that Martin
sort of scenarios and lifts.
He just lifts them directly. One of the things to get into with the Henry VI plays, by the way, part one does have one amazing scene where they do the roses. Remember, there's the scene with the red rose.
The scene in the temple garden, yeah.
There is no doubt that Shakespeare wrote that one scene. But you do find this sometimes in the scholarship. It's like, well, is it good? Yeah, that was Shakespeare, and the rest is written by some other dude, But there is no doubt that he wrote that one scene. I'll just mention that.
Well, of course, no, it was Don the Pleb, wasn't it?
Oh yes, yeah, of course, it was Don the Pleb who wrote.
So let's not forget it.
One of the things that I find fascinating about the Henry VI plays is how he shows you many different approaches to politics. Right, there are pragmatists, there are idealists, there are Machiavellians, there are, and it is very much this fallen world, right? That we're a long way from divine rights here, and in the middle of it all, of course, is this poor King Henry VI who just is not cut out to be the king. He wants to just be a religious scholar, basically. He wants to, and he is this. I mean, I think the real life Henry VI had a number of nervous breakdowns, didn't he, Simon?
I don't actually know enough about I mean, I've taken a lot of my history really from these plays because, I think it's likely to have been right. I think.
In real life, Henry VI had at least 2 nervous breakdowns that we know about. Well, in the play, Shakespeare just he is just in over his head. He doesn't want to be king, and he has some extraordinary speeches where he's just sitting on this rock and he's like, I wish I could just be a shepherd. And then as he's sitting there, as a result of his mismanagement of the kingdom, he watches a father kill his son and then a son kill his father. And he's just he's basically suicidal by this point. And then he gets completely dominated by his wife, Margaret of Anjou, both in real life and in the play. This happened as well, who, as Shakespeare depicts it, openly cuckolds the king. So he, what's the lover's name? Suffolk, right?
Suffolk, Duke of Suffolk.
Yeah, and he's a bastard as well. He's he is like a real cad, a real bounder. And these two Machiavellian characters, Margaret of Anjou, and Suffolk, they kind of rule in their own interests. They're just kind of corrupt, basically, and they're they're deeply unpopular in the kingdom because they're just kind of they're abusive with their power. A little bit like a Cersei Lannister type, I suppose. But she's also a very strong leader, is Margaret of Anjou, who wants to do it for her son because they've got a little son somehow called Edward, right? And then on the other side of things, you've got the Yorks, and obviously there's 3 of them. There's Richard of York, and then there's Gloucester, who becomes Richard III later on. There's
Edward Clarence, and there's George. Edward
and George, right? And some of the scenes where and there's Warwick as well, who's a major character in the play as well. Some of the scenes where Shakespeare has, King Edward's on the throne, Warwick has gone off to try to fix a marriage with him, find him some sort of French princess or whatever. And you've got this scene where Edward sees Elizabeth Woodville, and he tries to come on to her, and then the two brothers are hiding behind the arrest, the curtain, looking at these really like crude attempts by the king to get it on with this woman, and she's like, "Well, I'm not having sex with you until we get married." And he's like, "Yeah, okay, I'm the king, yeah." They're just really funny scenes. And then, of course, Warwick comes back and he's fucking furious, and he switches sides and gets the mad, like the basically decrepit Henry VI, plonks him on the throne. I mean, all of this stuff happened in real life as well. And I just think that Shakespeare's role as the national bard, as somebody who's a myth maker for the stories of the nation, as a nationalist, if you want to put it that way, is severely underrated by and anybody on our side of things should read these plays to learn about the history of the country and to kind of get a feel for the myths of England, if you want to put it that way.
I would certainly say watch these plays if you can, and there's some good versions out there, but the best one of these plays, the Henry VI, is one that BBC did in 1983, and it's set essentially. It starts in what looks like a sort of brightly coloured children's playground, and they do the first play in a sort of slightly jocular and light and kind of almost slightly vaudevillian way, and it gradually gets darker and harsher as you go through, and it's just like a brilliant epic sprawl of power politics, and I think that's what I kind of like.
They're really good. That's from the BBC cycle where they did every single. That's a very good production of it. I think the director was Jane Howell.
Yeah.
And Peter Benson plays Henry VI. He's very good in that. Yeah. It has the really tragic end with there's a pile of skulls, isn't there?
Bodies, and Richard III is kind of speared through, and she's kind of cuddling him, isn't she? Margaret.
No. I think it. No. It's at the end of Henry VI, Part 3.
Oh right, okay, yeah. The bodies.
There's a pile of skulls, and Margaret is just kind of nursing her dead son, fucking destroyed. And of course, Shakespeare. I mean, this didn't happen in real life, but Shakespeare, for some sadistic reason, has Margaret still as a holdover in Richard III. So she's like a ghost by that point, haunting the play as a reminder of all of the terrible things that have happened in the past. I think they're a terrific sequence of plays.
Just going back to your point about Shakespeare being the national bard, I don't know if you've been watching the Arts That Made Britain series or heard about it on the BBC. It's their kind of new attempt to look at history through culture. And the third episode, they have the obligatory Shakespeare, but it's very interesting how they portray it. They choose one play, and that's Othello. They kept going on about how multicultural Tudor England was. I don't know if you had any comments on the multicultural nature of Tudor England.
It's fucking bollocks. I mean, almost nobody who watched Othello would have ever seen a black man. That's just a fact. And a whole part of that play is about dealing with his exotic nature. I would say as well that the question of whether Othello was a black man or a Moor or a Turk, is not insignificant. There is almost no way he would have been this kind of sub-Saharan African that you see him as today. If you read the play, he is seen as a kind of Ottoman threat. That's how it would have been taken by the audience. He's from he belongs to Venice, right? He's pledged his allegiance to Venice, but because he has this background, he would have been seen. He wouldn't have been trusted, almost like an Afghani might not trust an American or something like that. You've got to put that play in its context, and the attempt to try to read it backwards from like a post-slavery American perspective is just fucking nonsense. It really is.
It's despicable.
Othello is one of the plays that has been more bastardized, more misused than any other. It has amazingly interesting things to say about the problem of being an outsider in a culture that distrusts you, though, because Othello, he wants to prove himself. And I think a lot of immigrants have this problem, right? Where it's like, well, to gain your trust, I need to kind of show my deeds all the time. And so he tries to put this kind of perfect version of himself.
There's often a tension in performance that actors talk about. It's about how much he's trying to fit in rather than to stand out in the context of Venice.
Yeah. I mean, he wants to be accepted by the Venetian society, and the only way he can do that is, well, he can't just be any old general. He has to be the best one, And this is something that
he'd be the character who would be attacked as an Oreo by people in race politics now.
Any outsider needs to find some way of being accepted, and to do it by like just I won't just lead your men. I'll be the best leader of your men. I won't just do this. I'll
make
prove it
himself
tenfold.
Indispensable.
Yeah. So that's what Othello tries to do, and of course, this makes his armor very fragile. And so when you get a character like Iago who seeks to just destroy him, basically, he knows which little threads to pull on to pull him apart. And I've always thought that in Othello, he's trying to build this perfect picture. Iago tries to start putting like taint on that. He tries to muddy up the picture, and when the picture's not perfect, Othello just cannot fucking handle it, and he's like, "Well, right, that's it. I'll just destroy it all then." If it can't be perfect, I can't have it at all, and that's when he that's when he ends up doing what he does. So, I do think that some of the modern interpretations of Othello are absolutely atrociously shite.
Going back briefly to
it's a deep play about. I mean, it is about race, but it's not about race in the way that they think.
Going back briefly to the Henry VI, as we talked about then, when I recommended that specific production, one of the reasons I did so is because the BBC did another version of the Henry VI's recently, but it was filled with kind of tick box casting choices. And
was
again,
that the Hollow Crown?
Hollow
Crown version.
Yeah. And I just feel, you want to sort of neutralize those concerns and look at the plays as the power pieces they are, rather than inflected with these.
Is that when they made Margaret of Andrew Black?
That's right. Yeah.
I mean, come on.
Yeah.
Come on.
But I mean, that's standard fare for the RSC now. If you go down there, I mean, I worked at the RSC 20 odd years ago, and casting was fairly sort of I guess unburdened by it at that time. There were a sort of few forays into that, but now it's quite striking how much of that is a neurotic concern of the casting departments.
It's utterly relentless, and one thing I wanted to do was just to go to some of the theatre websites, and you can just see there's just literally no escape, and to such a degree that I think we mentioned the minstrel show. There is something about that with all of this casting, because if you go to somewhere like the Old Vic or the Young Vic and see the actors, they're like 90% black nowadays.
Yeah.
But if you turn to the audience, they're like 3% black. There's always white middle class people there. So there's something fetishistic, something kind of like almost like the black man on the stage dancing and monkeying around.
But
for
you see,
literally,
see, this is not trivial though, because I've seen productions of Henry VI where they've had like half the cast black and things like this, or like they had the entire House of York were black, and they kind of tried to make them like almost like Zulus or something. It was very weird. But God. This is non-trivial, because this is at the heart of British identity and culture and history, right? So these people cannot be black. Do you understand? They are. These were historical figures, and they're trying to take that away by these. Like, imagine trying to do like African history, but you're casting white people in the white people in the roles instead, there'd be an outcry. And it's just obviously a deliberate act of
We should start doing that.
Cultural genocide is what I call it. So yeah, I don't think it's innocent at all.
And if anything, you're just changing the nature of the tensions of the conflicts in the plays and diluting the actual truths of, as I say, the lessons you can learn about the way elite power moves at that level, and that kind of conflict, and that is completely muted.
I argue in my book that the Henry VI plays are almost like Shakespeare's version of Machiavelli. It's he's going through the ABCs of power, what works, what doesn't work. Who's impulsive, who's calculating. It's interesting, by the way, that Warwick the Kingmaker, comes out almost as Shakespeare's ideal political figure. Like he really seems to give a very kind of nice treatment to Warwick.
Yes.
Which is interesting, of course, because he was local to Warwick. He was from Stratford, it was his. It would have
keeping faith.
A lot of people have said that there is a little bit of pro Warwick propaganda in the play because he was trying to suck up to the because Warwick Castle's still there, of course, even now. So there's a bit of that as well.
And I'll just say, in the BBC version, Warwick is played by the guy who played Zaphod Beeblebrox in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy for the BBC, and York is played by the guy who played King Theoden in the Lord of the Rings films, Bernard Hill. He's a fantastic.
Yeah, he's very good. Yeah, I mean, there's an amazing scene in I think it's Henry VI Part 3, isn't it, where Margaret puts the little paper crown on York, and has his cousin killed in front of him, and it's fucking brutal. I mean, these plays are brutal as well. There's a scene where Jack Cade has cut off the heads of these magistrates and he makes them kiss. Do you remember?
Sticks them on spears and makes them kiss in midair.
I mean, these are it's almost like Tarantino Shakespeare as well. These plays and Titus Andronicus are his kind of.
But you're not without affection for the characters. If you see them develop over a long arc like you do with these plays, you actually do. I mean, as you say, you get quite close to some of them. Warwick is a brilliant, strong character. York, fantastic character, and you learn to sort of grow up with them. And it is quite a wrench when they actually get killed. Sort of, it's not just all casual violence like Titus Andronicus. You think it's just gross. It's actually it's you're seeing historical purposes thwarted. And I think you included a bit of the Warwick death speech, didn't you, in something recently?
I did. I think it's worth mentioning as well that Shakespeare kind of invented a whole new genre with these sorts of plays, because they don't have the structure of either tragedy or comedy. They lead into one another, so it's kind of serial storytelling, and they're kind of open-ended, and time works in a different way than in other plays of this period. So that's he was doing something really quite innovative with these plays. So yes,
very much. So yes, I encourage you to see those.
Anything else? The Scribbler? Who's the Scribbler?
Isolate.
Sorry, can you hear that? Oh, jeez.
So Panama's actually making a fire. He's rubbing two bits of wood together.
Sorry, I didn't know that I could pick up. Sorry, my mistake. I was making some notes and thrashing this pen. My mistake.
Does anybody want to talk about any other plays, or should we wrap up? Do a part two.
I have to go shortly, so maybe let's wrap up for now.
Yeah, let me hit the super chats there. And I thought we talked about some interesting plays there. Many others to talk about. I mean, with Crap's last tape, maybe I'll do a whole one on Beckett one day. What do you think? I could do.
Sounds good.
Do a whole stream on Beckett because he's got a really interesting one.
Pinter as well. I don't think who else.
I just want to say, when AA mentioned entertaining Mr. Sloane, the Joe Orton play in one of the tweets he put out, a fun fact about that, when they did the film of that, the guy who plays the old dad who's in the house, Kemp, in that film, an actor called Alan Webb, he was originally cast as Palpatine.
Oh, was he really?
In Return of the Jedi, yeah. He fell out due to illness, but he was going to be the Palpatine.
Wow. Well, that's fortunate in a way. because we wouldn't have had the amazing Ian McDermott performance. But I mean, entertaining Mr. Sloan is definitely worth it's worth tracking down that film version. I tell you, apologies in advance if you do watch it. All right, so let's hit some of these super chats. JS says, "What's the panel's opinion on directors setting Shakespeare's plays in modern times? Apparently, someone is doing an adaptation of Macbeth in Ukraine, with King Duncan being a metaphor for Zelensky."
So I would say that I don't think that objectively there's anything wrong with doing a setting, but the trouble is that every time this has been done from sort of like 1930 up to now, it's just been for the purposes of pause. Like it's just been to pause the play up, essentially. I mean, this goes all the way back to like Orson Welles doing Macbeth with like Haitian voodoo people, like it's all just like progressive bluster, basically. It's let's keep Shakespeare relevant by setting it in the Ukraine. Let's do Julius Caesar with Trump and he gets stabbed and
I saw that production, by the way. Production was really good. Really? By the way, the Trump because they had you down in the mob. They made you part of the crowd, and the actual, other than the red hat part of it, there was very little relevance of the Trump thing. Didn't land at all. It was, but other than that, it was a very good production. I'll just say that there can be superb modern adaptations of Shakespeare. It just depends on how well they do it and what they're trying to do. But like Hat says, there's a lot of pause.
It's just the forced nature of the let's be relevant stuff. It's what I call trendy vicar productions, where he gets his guitar out and tries to zhuzh up the church service, as it were. They're doing it with Shakespeare in a very patronizing way, and it does feel like look how pointedly relevant we can be. It's like you're sort of banging the audience over the head with it in a way that's
Shakespeare on a council estate. It's so relevant.
Well, and I'll also say that sometimes there's just a superficial kind of aesthetic. Kenneth Branagh does that a lot. Like he's got one production which is in like Imperial Japan or something. It's just like, what for? It just looks cool, There's no. He just likes the clothes. There's a good bit of that happens as well.
I would also just add to this that Shakespeare isn't just like a lot of plays and some poems. It's some of the most metaphysically relevant pieces of words ever put down on a page. I mean, what's that famous quote about Shakespeare being the closest thing to encompassing all of existence, basically, in its language? I mean, there's a reason why he's held up as perhaps the greatest, basically writer who ever lived, because he was able to, through what were essentially, entertainments for the masses, basically, take us to kind of philosophical ecstasies, if you want to put it that way. I mean, it's incredible.
Glow in the Dark says, "Why do things come and go? Usually when a crop fails, it isn't some unstoppable change of nature. Usually it is because the farmer did something wrong. Example, the Dust Bowl. When a drought happens, a farmer doesn't go, oh, well, I guess I'll die now. Farmer hunts for water, digs a well, a search for a solution, something productive." There's usually some when it comes to cultural change, there's usually some other driver, technology often, that, video killed the radio star, right? That's often what it is. Okay. Machiavelli sucks to go says, sorry, hold on. There's more than that. Dan Tyrell says, thoughts on Coriolanus. Coriolanus, the bard's most base character, a military lion who chads through the entire play by scorning foxes and cowards. Coriolanus is very interesting. I would say that attempts to make Shakespeare a Democrat are generally bad. There's no way that he was a kind of monarchist through and through with some. I think Shakespeare's sensibilities were conservative for the period. when compared with his contemporaries, and I think it's because he was rural in spirit rather than city in spirit. He was not an urbanite. He was a country boy, and I think that comes through in a lot of his plays.
How do you feel about the theory that Shakespeare was a Catholic AA? Or that he
I mean, there's something to that. There is something to that, because if he had a Christianity, it's definitely on the Catholic side of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
There is no doubt about that. However, I feel like I talked about this before. I feel like his Christianity is very heterodox, bordering on pagan naturalism. I genuinely believe that. Just because of the way it manifests, just because of the way nature and the cycles of nature seem very important to his kind of conception of the moral universe. I'll just put it that way. And often where you may look for salvation or repentance, it doesn't, like, he just doesn't give those speeches. There's just nothing, you know. Often it's just brackets, dies, you know. So I do think that his Christianity is not straightforward at all. Even if, you know, I'm not suggesting he was an atheist, but I don't think he was a textbook theologian of any stripe, really. Also, people forget that the default religion was what people would call Catholic. Is like they were trying to bring these reforms in, but what people did in their everyday life, their rituals, the living tradition, if you want, was basically Catholic, you know, with a few like anti-papal sentiments here and there, you know. Rebel with a Cause says Wyndham Lewis, deepest law. Ben Wheeler says
hang on well, if you want the stream on Wyndham Lewis, head over to the Pharaoh channel, where Pharaoh, myself, and Alexander Adams do a deep dive on Wyndham Lewis. Got to plug that.
Yeah, World War artist #1.
Yes.
Ben Wheeler says, when I worked a tech job for a major phone company, and as a supervisor, nothing would send me into a frothing rage more than broken sales promises. So there we go. Maybe that was Ben Wheeler giving a bollocking in those glass cubes. Machiavelli Sucks to Go says, I think your obsession with American imperialism shows your Iranian side. Lol. Actually, people forget how much when we were growing up. I don't know about you guys in school, but American imperialism was a massive concern, you know, into the 90s in this country. It's only very recently that there seems to have been a total capitulation to Americanization here. The British identity and British culture should reject Americanism, and it's a concern right there in Look Back in Anger, and it's always been a concern because American culture is anti-culture in many ways. It's not indigenous to this place.
Yeah, I remember definitely as a kid there was this whole idea. It was always framed in terms of the Iraq War that, you know, wow, you know, Blair's just doing whatever Bush, you know, wants him to do. You know, we're not really, you know, it's all a farce, really. That was the kind of average normie opinion, even if they then continue to vote for him. But yeah, you wouldn't get that now. It's just completely.
It was a left wing drive as well. It wasn't necessarily a right wing concern. It was a left wing talking point about American imperialism.
Yeah, John Pilger very much sort of grinding that stuff throughout the 80s, and of course things like Iran-Contra. I remember, you know, Ollie North and all of those kinds of things left everybody with a kind of bad taste in the mouth. America looking very shady.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't think it's necessarily an Iranian side, because I think a British person should absolutely be aware of the extent to which the culture is Americanized.
Yes.
And if you read Evola on America, you know that has other implications as well. Negrified America, remember? It's a kind of there shouldn't be middle class white women in bloody Chelmsford or something twerking. No. And yet that happens on a daily basis. Yeah. You should be against that. Wiggle says, just like Othello, also opinions on John Osborne's play. Angry Young Men, Deepest Law. Wiggles, did you
Listen.
miss the half of this stream? We spent an hour talking about John Osborne.
D minus.
Yeah,
CAA after
not
class.
paying attention. Throw a board rubber at him. Not been listening.
Billy at the back of the class there. Pay attention, son. All right, that's it. Anything you'd like to shell before we get out of here? Pharaoh.
Yes, buy my new course, Foundations of Entrepreneurship. I'm working on an advert to boost sales. I've got a theme tune. I've got some great bits of footage.
Excellent.
Maybe we'll see it next week or in a couple of weeks' time. We'll see.
It's not good enough, Wiggles. The stream starts at 3 p.m. Be on time. Simon Roberts, anything?
I'm on Hector Drummond's channel on our show, The Guff Stream, this Thursday, actually, because I'm going to be away on Friday. And I'm also going to go on Proper Horror Show's channel to talk about a horror film at some point up in June. So looking forward to that as well.
What do you pick?
I think they poll for which film you get to do. I mean, I suggested a couple of films. I suggested either The Wicker Man or Barbarian Sound Studio, which is kind of meta horror. But I think they pick it for you. So I might have to get what I'm given. I hope not. I'd like to do something in the folk horror genre.
I want to do a Amicus. If I ever go on that show, I want to do the Amicus portmanteau horror. I think it's called like Asylum. That's the one.
Yes.
With a Charlotte Rampling.
Classic genre. Yeah.
Hat, anything you'd like to plug, sir?
Keep an eye on my channel. Please tip my Ko-Fi page. My book, The Authentic Reactionary, is on track to come out this summer, looking at probably August now. So I'll give you more information when that's coming. I'll be appearing on Pharaoh's channel every so often. I think that's it for now.
Excellent. Thank you very much, everyone. Join the channel, buy a mug, buy a course, join my Substack, but most importantly of all, get out. But not you, Wiggles. You go back to the start and listen to our John Osborne discussion.
Despicable.